He built her empire. She never told him she needed him to stay. The night he walked out, she finally understood what she'd been too afraid to say. And by then, it was already too late. This is the story of two people who gave everything to their careers and almost nothing to themselves, until the moment they had nothing left to give. If you've ever burned so bright you forgot what you were burning for, stay until the very end. Like this video and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The resignation letter was 11 sentences long. Ethan Brooks had counted them 3 times before he slid it under Victoria Hayes' office door at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, when the building was still empty and the hallways smelled like industrial cleaner and leftover ambition. 11 sentences. 3 years of his life. 3 years of late nights and weekend calls and skipped school recitals and cold dinners eaten standing over a kitchen sink, reduced to a single page that he'd rewritten 8 times before finally deciding that no version of it would ever sound the way he actually felt. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't take the elevator. He walked down 4 flights of stairs, pushed through the fire exit, and stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing air that felt different now that he wasn't anyone's anything. His car was a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked side mirror and a car seat in the back that his daughter Sophie had outgrown 2 years ago, but that he'd never gotten around to removing. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel. Relief, maybe. Or terror. What he felt instead was a strange, hollow quiet, like the moment after a fire alarm stops and you're still standing there, not quite sure if the danger is gone or just pausing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't look at it. Bum. 3 years ago, Ethan Brooks had not been the kind of man who let things go to ruin. He'd been methodical about his life in a way that probably looked, from the outside, like competence. He'd been 30 years old, recently divorced, and newly sole custody of a 4-year-old girl who still called him daddy, with a particular note of desperation in her voice whenever he left a room, because she'd learned early that people you loved had a way of not coming back. His ex-wife Claire had moved to Portland for reasons she explained calmly and practically. A job, a person, a version of herself that didn't fit the life they'd been building. And Ethan had stood in their kitchen and listened to her and felt something that wasn't anger or grief so much as exhaustion. They'd been running on fumes for 2 years by then. When she left, what he mostly felt was relieved Claude's response was interrupted. Try again. The letter sat on Victoria's desk for 6 hours before she opened it. She'd found it when she arrived at 7:15, slipped under the door with the kind of quiet precision that was entirely Ethan. No drama, no confrontation, just the thing itself sitting there waiting for her. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope. She set her coffee down, picked it up, and then, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself, put it in her desk drawer without reading it, and spent the next 6 hours running back-to-back meetings like the letter wasn't there. Her assistant Marcus noticed something was off by noon. He brought her a sandwich she didn't ask for and set it on the corner of her desk without comment, which was his way of saying he was paying attention without making her acknowledge it. She appreciated that about Marcus. He'd learned in his first 3 months that Victoria Hayes did not respond well to being asked if she was okay. She wasn't okay. She hadn't been okay since the Jakarta deal collapsed 2 weeks ago, triggering a cascade of internal reviews that turned the entire executive floor into a pressure cooker. She'd been running on 4 hours of sleep and back-to-back phone calls with investors who spoke in careful, measured tones that meant they were unhappy but too professional to say so directly. Through all of it, every late-night call, every revised forecast, every emergency board briefing, Ethan had been there. Sitting across from her at the conference table at midnight with 2 cups of terrible vending machine coffee, working through numbers with the particular focused quiet of a man who had learned to solve problems instead of panicking about them. She finally opened the letter at 1:23 in the afternoon between her budget review and a 3 o'clock call with legal. She read it once, then she read it again. 11 sentences. The last one said, "I am grateful for everything this role taught me, and I genuinely wish you and the company continued success." She sat with that sentence for a long time. Genuinely wish you continued success. Not, I'll be in touch. Not let me know if you need anything during the transition. A clean severance. The kind of ending you wrote when you were done in a way that was total and final, when you weren't leaving space for a conversation. Victoria put the letter back in the drawer, straightened her jacket, and took her 3 o'clock call. She didn't tell anyone what was in the envelope. What she didn't say in any of those meetings, what she didn't say to Marcus when he asked if she needed him to clear her afternoon, what she hadn't said to Ethan in 3 years of working together, was that she had noticed everything. She noticed when he started coming in earlier. It had been subtle at first, just 15 or 20 minutes ahead of his usual time, but by the beginning of the year he was arriving before the cleaning crew finished and leaving after the security guard did his final round. She noticed when he stopped bringing lunch from home, those slightly sad Tupperware containers he'd carried for the first 2 years, usually something Sophie had reportedly helped pack, which meant whatever was inside had an unpredictable ratio of fruit snacks to actual food. The Tupperware disappeared and got replaced by nothing, which meant he was either not eating or grabbing something from the vending machine, and neither option was good. She noticed the way he'd started holding himself differently in meetings. In the beginning, Ethan had been the kind of person who sat forward in his chair, who asked questions with genuine curiosity and pushed back when something didn't make sense. Somewhere in the past 8 months that had changed. He still asked the right questions and said the right things, but he was doing it from somewhere further away, like he'd developed a second skin between himself and the room and was operating from behind it. She noticed all of this and said nothing, because Victoria Hayes had built her entire professional identity on the principle that emotional observation was not the same as emotional involvement, and she was very careful about the difference. Or she had been. She had tried to be. The truth, which she was not ready to examine directly, was that Ethan Brooks had become the exception to every rule she'd made for herself. They had not started as anything resembling friends. When Ethan joined Caldwell Manufacturing 3 years ago as Director of Operations, Victoria had been CEO for 14 months and was still in the phase of her tenure where she was working hardest to establish that she was in charge. She'd taken over from a founder who'd run the company like a family business for 30 years, which meant the culture was warm and nostalgic and deeply resistant to any process that hadn't existed in 1987. She'd spent her first year making changes that were necessary and unpopular and arrived at a kind of exhausted standoff with most of her senior team, who respected her competence and found her personally difficult to read. Ethan's first week, he'd sat in a department head meeting and listened to 45 minutes of what was essentially a politely coded argument about whether the new inventory system was actually an improvement or just change for change's sake. When it got to him, he'd said, "I don't have a horse in this fight yet, but from what I can see, both sides are right about different things, and the reason nobody's moving forward is that we're arguing about the solution before we've agreed on what the actual problem is." The room had gone quiet. Victoria had looked at him across the table and thought, finally. They'd had a working relationship built on shared efficiency for about a year before it became something harder to categorize. It happened gradually, and then suddenly, the way most things do. The late nights on the Jakarta expansion started it, thrown together by necessity, working through logistical problems that didn't have clean answers, eating bad takeout from the place 2 blocks over that was open until midnight. They talked about work because that was why they were there, and then they talked about other things because it was late and their guards were down. She found out about Sophie during one of those nights. He'd mentioned needing to check in, something about a babysitter who had a curfew. And when she'd asked if he had kids, he'd pulled out his phone and shown her a photo without any preamble. Sophie was 6 in the picture, gap-toothed and wearing a princess costume over what appeared to be a soccer uniform, beaming at the camera like she'd invented joy. "She insisted on the cape," Ethan said. "We were on our way to her game. I picked my battles." Victoria had looked at the photo for longer than was strictly necessary. "She looks like you. She's got her mom's stubbornness. She gets the height from me, so far." He'd smiled in a way that was tired and genuine and not performing anything, and put his phone away, and they'd gone back to the spreadsheets. But something had shifted. After that, their conversations had a different texture. Not unprofessional. They were always professional, always careful, but more honest. He told her things he probably wouldn't have shared with most colleagues, that his divorce had been mutual and civil, and still somehow the loneliest year of his life. That co-parenting from 2 different cities was manageable in a logistical sense and devastating in a human one. That he worried constantly about Sophie, not the big dramatic worries, but the small persistent ones. Whether she was lonely at school, whether she missed her mom in ways she didn't have the vocabulary to explain, whether he was doing enough. Victoria had listened and not offered platitudes, which he seemed to appreciate. She wasn't naturally good at comfort. She was good at listening and at asking the kind of questions that didn't push but opened things slightly. In return, and this had surprised her, the in return of it, the reciprocity, he'd asked about her. Not her company strategy or her career trajectory. The other things. What she'd wanted to be before she wanted to be this. Whether she actually liked the work or had just gotten good at it. Whether she ever got tired. No one asked Victoria Hayes if she got tired. Everyone assumes I'm a machine, she'd said once, somewhere around 2 in the morning with the Jakarta proposal spread across the conference table between them. Ethan had looked up from the document. You've kind of built that reputation deliberately. I know. So why tell me? She hadn't had a good answer. She'd said something deflecting about it being too late at night for her to maintain the performance, and he'd laughed and let it go, and they'd gone back to work. But the question had stayed with her afterward. Why tell me? Because he was safe, maybe. Because he was consistent. Because in 3 years of working together, he had never once used something she told him against her, or brought it up at the wrong moment, or leveraged her honesty for his own benefit. That was rarer than it had any right to be. She had not let herself think too carefully about what that meant. The Jakarta expansion had been Ethan's project in all the ways that mattered. He'd spent 8 months building it, the supplier relationships, the regulatory framework, the staffing model, the contingency plans. He'd traveled to Jakarta 3 times and come back from the last trip looking like someone who'd been at war with a time zone and lost. The deal collapsed not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because of a political shift in the regional government that nobody could have predicted, and he'd sat in the emergency meeting where they dissected the fallout and said almost nothing, which was how she knew he was worse off than she'd thought. After the meeting, she'd found him standing by the window at the end of the hallway, looking down at the street below with the expression of a man trying very hard to not feel whatever he was feeling. Ethan. He turned around. His face was controlled and professional. I know we need to talk about the restructuring plan. I can have a preliminary outline by... I didn't come out here to talk about the restructuring plan. A pause. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Okay. Are you all right? I'm fine. You don't look fine. With respect, he said, and there was something careful and tight in his voice. I've been running on 5 hours of sleep for 6 weeks, and just watched 3 years of work fall apart in a government meeting I wasn't even invited to. I think not looking fine is a pretty reasonable response to that. That's not what I'm asking. Another pause, longer this time. He turned back to the window. I don't know what you're asking, Victoria. She'd stood there and known she should say something and hadn't known how to say it. And after a moment she'd told him she'd see him at the briefing at 4 and walked back to her office. And that was the last real conversation they'd had before she found the letter under her door. 3 days after his resignation, she called his cell phone at 9 in the evening. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice on the recording was businesslike and brief. You've reached Ethan Brooks. Leave a message. She didn't leave a message. She called again the next morning. Same result. She told herself it was professional concern. She had a company to run and he'd left without a transition plan. There were projects midstream, relationships with vendors that existed primarily in his head, institutional knowledge that lived nowhere except his brain, and whatever notes he'd kept on a work laptop he'd already returned. There were legitimate operational reasons to need to reach him. She sat in her office and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows that had seemed like a power move when she'd first taken the corner suite, and now mostly made her feel like she was on display, and she admitted in the privacy of her own head that she wasn't calling about the vendor relationships. Marcus knocked and came in without waiting, which he only did when it was urgent. The board wants a statement on the Jakarta write-down by Friday. Tell them they'll have it Thursday. Also, he hesitated. HR is asking about a transition timeline for the Director of Operations role. Victoria turned away from the window. Tell them I'll handle it. Do you want me to post the... I said I'll handle it, Marcus. He left. She turned back to the window. She thought about the photograph of Sophie in the princess costume. She thought about late nights and bad takeout, and the way Ethan had once spent 20 minutes helping her figure out why she was so angry after a board meeting, asking questions until she worked out that it wasn't the board's decision that had bothered her, but the way they'd looked at her while delivering it, like they were waiting for her to confirm their low expectations. He hadn't offered solutions. He just helped her see what was actually wrong. She thought about the last time they'd had coffee together in the small kitchen on the fourth floor, 2 weeks before he resigned. He'd been standing at the counter stirring sugar into his coffee, and she'd made some passing comment about how the Q3 numbers looked more promising, and he'd said, "Yeah, just that, yeah," with the particular flatness of someone who is present physically and somewhere else entirely, and she'd registered it and filed it and kept walking back to her office because there was always something more immediately urgent that yet kept coming back to her now. She picked up her phone and called him a third time. This time, it didn't even ring. It went straight to voicemail. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work, because that was what she did when she didn't know what else to do, and she had been doing it for so long that she sometimes confused it for being okay. She wasn't okay. She was starting to understand that she hadn't been for a while. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that at that same moment, Ethan was sitting on the floor of Sophie's bedroom with his back against her bed, watching his daughter sleep. Sophie was 7 now, and she slept the way she'd slept since she was a baby, arms flung wide, face slack and unguarded, sprawled across the mattress like sleep was something that had happened to her suddenly rather than something she'd chosen. There was a book half open beside her pillow that she'd been reading before she fell asleep. Something about a girl who discovered she could talk to horses, and her stuffed rabbit, a grubby gray thing named, inexplicably, Kevin, was tucked under her chin. Ethan had come in to check on her and sat down and hadn't gotten up. He didn't have his phone. He'd turned it off 2 days ago, which was not a decision so much as an action that had happened while he was staring at it and watching the missed calls accumulate, and once he'd done it, he'd found that he couldn't quite make himself reverse it. There was a specific and terrible kind of relief in being unreachable. It made him feel guilty and free at the same time, which was a combination he wasn't sure he deserved. Sophie made a small sound in her sleep and shifted and pulled Kevin tighter against her chest. Ethan watched her and thought about how much of her life he'd spent in a building on the other side of the city. How many mornings he'd handed her off to a babysitter before she was fully awake. How many bedtime routines he'd done on autopilot, barely present, already composing emails in his head. How many times she'd said, "Daddy, watch this," and he'd watched but not quite seen. He wasn't doing that now. He was here, in her room, watching her breathe. It was not a small thing. It felt enormous and simple, and like something he'd been postponing for years without realizing it was a postponement. He thought about Victoria. He thought about the letter under the door and the phone he'd turned off, about the expression on her face in the hallway after the Jakarta meeting when she'd asked if he was all right, and he'd said he was fine, and they'd both known he was lying. He thought about 3 years of conversations that had mattered more to him than almost anything else in his life, and about the fact that he had never once said any version of that out loud, and about whether he had walked out of that building because he was broken or because staying would have made the breaking worse. Probably both. Probably neither explanation was the whole truth. Sophie sighed in her sleep and the book slid off the pillow and hit the floor, and Ethan picked it up and set it on her nightstand. He sat there for another few minutes in the particular quiet of a house where a child is sleeping, and then he got up, turned off the lamp, and went to make himself something to eat. An actual meal, the first one he'd cooked in 2 weeks, because he was trying, imperfectly and haltingly, to begin the work of not losing himself anymore. Victoria's missed calls sat silent on his phone in the other room. He wasn't ready, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he thought he might eventually be. 2 weeks after Ethan turned his phone back on, he found 17 missed calls from Victoria and 1 voicemail. He almost didn't listen to it. He stood in his kitchen on a Wednesday morning with Sophie eating cereal at the table behind him and his thumb hovering over the play button for a solid 30 seconds before he pressed it. Her voice on the recording was not what he expected. He didn't know exactly what he had expected. Professional? Probably. Controlled. The voice she used when she was delivering information she'd already decided how to frame. What he got instead was something quieter, like she'd recorded it late and wasn't entirely sure what she was doing. Ethan. I'm not calling about work. I mean, there are work things, obviously, but that's not why I keep calling. A pause. The sound of her exhaling. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. That's it. You don't have to call back if you don't want to. She'd hung up there. He set his phone down on the counter and looked at it. The way you look at something that has just changed the shape of a room. Daddy, Sophie's voice from behind him. My milk is warm. You've been sitting there for 20 minutes. I was reading. Put the book down when you're eating. He turned around and took her bowl and poured fresh milk and put it back in front of her, and she spooned a bite into her mouth without looking up from the book. He watched her for a moment. This small, concentrated person who carried his cheekbones and her mother's stubbornness, and a particular capacity for getting completely absorbed in things that he recognized as his own, and felt the specific complicated love of a parent watching their kid be entirely themselves. He picked his phone back up and put it in his pocket. He didn't call Victoria back that day, but he didn't delete the voicemail either, and that night after Sophie was in bed, he listened to it 2 more times in the dark of his bedroom, and after the second time he lay on his back staring at the ceiling and accepted, without much fanfare, that he was in love with her. He'd known it for a while, probably. The kind of knowing that lives in the back of your chest and gets very quiet when you're busy and very loud when you're not. He'd been busy for a long time. Now he wasn't. He didn't do anything with the knowing yet. He just let it be there. Victoria, in those same 2 weeks, had done something she hadn't done since she was 26. She'd called her sister. Renata Hayes lived in Tucson and taught high school chemistry and had 3 kids and a husband who coached youth soccer and a completely different life than Victoria in almost every quantifiable way. They talked maybe 4 or 5 times a year, on birthdays and certain holidays and occasional moments of crisis, and their conversations were friendly and a little awkward in the way conversations between siblings who diverged early always were, fond but with gaps, like 2 people reading from editions of the same book that had different chapters. Victoria had called her on a Sunday night without planning to. She'd been sitting in her apartment looking at the city and thinking about Ethan and the voicemail she'd left and whether she'd said too much or not enough, and suddenly she was dialing Renata's number. "Vic?" Renata answered on the second ring, surprised. "It's 9 o'clock. "I know. Is this a bad time?" "No, the kids are down. Hold on." The sound of a door closing, then quiet. "Okay, what's wrong?" "Why does something have to be wrong?" "Because you never call on Sundays and you sound weird." Victoria considered denying the weirdness and decided it wasn't worth it. "I think I'm in love with someone." A long pause. "Okay." "He works for me. Worked for me. He resigned." "Okay." "He's a single father. He's 32. We worked together for 3 years and nothing happened. He just left and now I can't stop." She stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because you needed to say it out loud to someone who couldn't fire you or write about it in a trade publication." Renata's voice was dry and warm at the same time. "Have you told him?" "No." "Are you going to?" Victoria looked at the city. "I don't know. I've been trying to figure out if it's real or if I just miss him because he was useful to me." "That's a horrible way to think about it." "I know, but I need to be honest with myself. There's a difference between being honest and being clinical about everything that scares you." Victoria didn't answer right away. "Vic." "I know," she said again, more quietly. "When's the last time something scared you?" She thought about it. "The Jakarta deal falling through." "I said something, not some business thing." Another pause. "I don't know." Renata made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. "That's your answer, maybe. That he scares you." Victoria sat with that after she hung up. She sat with it for a long time, in the quiet of her apartment that had always felt like a deliberate choice and had lately begun to feel like a symptom. October arrived with the particular sharpness of a city fall. Cold mornings, warm afternoons, the smell of something changing that was either the season or just the feeling of time moving without your permission. Ethan had been gone from Caldwell for 6 weeks. Victoria had filled his role on an interim basis with a man named Dwight Park, who was competent and thorough and communicated primarily through status reports that were so comprehensive they took 40 minutes to read and still somehow managed to convey almost nothing about how the actual work was going. She found herself more than once starting to type an email to Ethan's work address before remembering he didn't have a work address anymore. She found out through Marcus, who found out through someone in accounts payable, which was how all real information traveled in a company, that Ethan had been seen at Sophie's school pickup twice in 1 week, which for the past 3 years had almost never happened because he was always at work. He was apparently also taking Sophie to her soccer games on Saturday mornings, which he'd been missing most of the season. This information arrived as a casual update, the kind of office gossip that floats through a building without anyone meaning anything by it, and Victoria took it in and thought, Good. She meant it. Whatever he was doing, it sounded like something that mattered. She also thought, I miss him in a way I don't know how to put away. She tried putting it away several more times. She threw herself into work, which had always been the reliable solution, but the thing about reliable solutions is they work until they don't. And this one stopped working sometime in the middle of November when she was sitting in her car in the parking garage after an 11-hour day, not quite ready to drive home to her apartment, and she realized she'd been sitting there for 20 minutes without noticing. She turned on the car and drove home. She ate dinner standing at her kitchen counter and worked until midnight and went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about Renata's voice on the phone, saying there's a difference between being honest and being clinical about everything that scares you. She was getting very tired of being scared. Well, the storm came through on a Thursday night in the second week of November. The kind of storm that surprised the city, colder and wetter and more sustained than any of the forecast models had predicted, rolling in around 7 in the evening and dropping the temperature 15 degrees in an hour. Victoria had been in back-to-back calls until 8:30. When they ended, she was still at the office, sitting in the dark with her jacket on because she'd been too tired to turn the overhead lights on, and the motion sensors had given up on her an hour ago. The city outside the window was a wash of blurred headlights and rain on glass, and she could hear the wind pushing against the building in steady pressure. She should have gone home. She knew she should have gone home. She picked up her phone and opened Ethan's contact and looked at his number. Her voicemail from 6 weeks ago sat there in her outgoing call log, like a small monument to the moment she'd let herself be something other than composed. He hadn't called back. She'd decided to accept that. His silence was an answer, maybe not a permanent one, but a real one, and she told herself she could respect that. Sitting in her dark office in a building that had mostly emptied out, with a storm pressing against the glass and the city going blurry in the rain, she stopped respecting it. She called him. It rang twice. He picked up. Victoria. His voice was careful in the way it was when he didn't know the reason for the call. Are you home? A beat. Yes. Why? I need to talk to you. Okay. A pause. You can talk to me on the phone. I'd rather not. A longer pause. She could hear something in the background. Television, maybe. The muffled sound of a cartoon at low volume. Sophie, probably. A Thursday night at home. Victoria, it's pouring outside. I know. Another pause. Is this about work? No? Silence. She waited it out. Okay, he said finally, and his voice had shifted into something quieter. Okay. She drove to his apartment through rain that turned the streetlights into something impressionistic, fighting wipers that needed replacing, and a heater that took too long to warm up, and a kind of full-body adrenaline she hadn't felt in so long she'd nearly forgotten what it was. She was terrified and awake in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with the particular aliveness of finally moving towards something you'd spent too long standing still about. She found his building, parked badly, got soaked between the car and the entrance because she'd left her umbrella in her office. She stood in the lobby and pressed his apartment button on the intercom, and when his voice came through the static, she said, "It's me," and the door buzzed open. I was standing in the doorway of his apartment when she got off the elevator. He was in a gray sweatshirt and jeans, and his feet were bare, which somehow made everything feel more real. He looked at her, wet, no umbrella, showing up at his door on a Thursday night in the middle of a storm. And something moved through his expression that she couldn't entirely catalog. Sophie's asleep, he said quietly. Come in. She stepped inside. The apartment was warm and lit in a way that felt lived in. A lamp on in the corner, a book open face down on the couch. A kid's drawing of something horse-related taped to the refrigerator visible from where she stood. It was the home of a person who was actually using it, and the contrast with her own apartment, which always felt like a place she was staying rather than a place she lived, hit her in a way she didn't expect. Ethan closed the door and stood and looked at her. He didn't offer her a towel or a dry jacket or anything, which wasn't coldness but restraint. He was holding himself very still, she noticed, like he was waiting to understand what this was before he let himself respond to it. She stood in his entryway and dripped on his floor, and all the words she'd been arranging in the car on the way over turned out to be useless. I don't have a speech, she said. I didn't think you did. I practiced one in the car. What happened to it? It fell apart. She paused. You didn't call me back. No. I needed some time with that. I know. His voice was not apologetic but not defensive either, just honest. I needed time too. She looked at him. He looked back. The rain was loud against the window and the lamp made the room amber, and outside the storm was doing what it wanted to do, and she was standing in his apartment soaking wet, which was frankly not how she'd imagined this going. I miss you, she said, not as my director of operations, not as someone who made my job easier. I miss you, talking to you, the way you think, the way you tell me when I'm wrong without making me feel stupid, the way you... She stopped. This is the part where the speech fell apart. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How long? How long what? How long have you felt like that? She considered lying or hedging or giving some qualified version of the truth. She was tired of all of those. A long time, longer than I admitted to myself. He nodded slowly, not surprised exactly, more like something he'd been carrying had shifted and he was adjusting to the new weight. Ethan. She said his name and then didn't know what came after it. I know, he said. His voice was low and rough around the edges in a way that told her he meant it. I know. I've been in love with you for... He exhaled through his nose. For a while. Longer than is probably reasonable. The admission landed in the room and sat there. She'd half expected it, and it still felt like something being set down that had been held too long. So, she waited. He crossed his arms, not closed off, just holding himself. So the problem isn't whether I feel it. Then what's the problem? He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke it was with the careful honesty of someone who'd been thinking about exactly this. 3 weeks ago, I was sitting on Sophie's bedroom floor watching her sleep, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd really been present for her. Not there, but somewhere else present. Actually there. He paused. I was so consumed by work, by the company, by... He stopped, and she understood that the pause included her, and she appreciated that he didn't say it directly. I lost track of myself completely, and I can't... He stopped again. I can't walk back into something as big as this and do the same thing. I can't do that to her. I can't do that to myself. Victoria didn't say anything. She was listening in the way she listened when what she was hearing mattered, not waiting for a gap to fill, just actually taking it in. It's not that I don't want this, he said. I'm not trying to close a door. He looked at her with something she recognized as both openness and exhaustion. But I'm not healed yet. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not defined by the job. And I need to do that before I can be anything real to anyone else. The rain against the window, the lamp. Kevin the rabbit, probably, somewhere in Sophie's room. Victoria stood there in his entryway and felt, along with everything else, a complicated respect. Because he was right, and she knew he was right. And the easiest thing in the world would have been for him to feel what he felt, and let it override all that reasoning. She had wanted that. She could admit it. She had driven here in a storm, partly hoping that the sheer momentum of it would carry them somewhere simple. But this was the man she'd actually missed. The one who told her when things were wrong, and what they actually were. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay? I'm not going anywhere. She met his eyes. I've been afraid of this for 3 years. I think I can be patient for a little longer. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not exactly, but something close to it. Like a wall not coming down but stepping slightly aside. You should take off that jacket, he said. You're going to get water everywhere. I already got water everywhere. There's more of it coming off the jacket. He moved to the small closet by the door and came back with a dry towel, which he handed to her without ceremony. She took it and started pressing the water out of her hair and felt, weirdly, less scared than she'd been at the office. Less scared than she'd been in the parking garage sitting there for 20 minutes. The worst of it, the waiting, the not knowing, the years of not saying it, was behind her now. What was in front of her was uncertain and genuine and built on real ground, and that was something she could work with. How is she? Victoria asked, meaning Sophie. Asleep, reading about horses. He almost smiled. She wants one. Does she know how big horses are? I've explained it. She says size isn't an obstacle. She sounds like someone who's going to be very hard to say no to. She already is. This time he did smile, and it was the tired, real, complicated smile of a father who was telling the truth about something that was both a problem and the best thing in his life. Victoria stood in his entryway with a borrowed towel and wet shoes and nothing resolved except the most important thing. She wasn't going to push. She wasn't going to optimize this or manage it or find the most efficient path through it. She was going to let it be what it actually was. That was new for her. She wasn't sure she was going to be good at it, but she was going to try. She left 40 minutes later after tea. She hadn't asked for, but he'd made anyway. Chamomile, because it was the only thing in the cabinet. Sitting at his kitchen table and talking about nothing in particular. Sophie's horse book, a news story they'd both seen, a problem with the building's water pressure he'd been trying to get the landlord to fix for 6 weeks. Just two people talking in a warm room while a storm worked itself out outside. At the door, he said, "Victoria." She turned. "Thank you for coming." He said it simply, without performance. "I mean it." She looked at him for a moment in the doorway. "Thank you for opening the door." She walked to the elevator and he watched her go, and neither of them said anything else. And the door closed, and the storm was still going, but something in the night had changed its weight. Upstairs, in her room, Sophie slept with Kevin tucked under her chin, entirely unaware that the shape of her father's life had just shifted in the quiet way things sometimes do. Not with noise or breaking, but with two people finally telling each other the truth. The motorcycle was a 1987 Honda Shadow that Ethan had bought off a neighbor for $400 and a promise to stop letting his dog dig under their shared fence. It didn't run. That was the point, actually. He hadn't bought it because he wanted a motorcycle. He'd bought it because he wanted something that was broken in a specific and fixable way, something where the problem had a name and the solution had steps and progress was visible. He dragged it into the building's small maintenance area in the parking garage, borrowed a floor jack from the guy in 2B who had more tools than reasons to use them, and started taking it apart on a Saturday morning while Sophie sat on a turned-over plastic crate nearby, doing homework and periodically asking questions he mostly couldn't answer. Why is that part so dirty? Because it hasn't been cleaned in probably 20 years. Why not? Because whoever owned it stopped taking care of it. Sophie considered this. That's sad. A little bit, yeah. Are you going to fix all of it? That's the plan. She went back to her homework. He went back to the carburetor. The garage smelled like oil and concrete, and a little like the winter that was coming, and it was not comfortable or romantic or particularly pleasant, and it was exactly what he needed. Something that asked only for his hands and his attention and gave back the particular satisfaction of a thing slowly becoming what it was supposed to be. December moved through the city the way December does, with short days and early dark, and the particular social pressure of a season that expects everyone to feel more than they do. Ethan had always found December manageable as long as he stayed busy with the right things. This year, for the first time in a while, he was doing that. The motorcycle in the mornings when Sophie was at school, pick up at 3, dinner that he actually cooked, bedtimes that he was present for, actually present, not running numbers in his head while he read the horse book for the 4th time this week. Sophie had noticed. She hadn't said anything about it in a direct way. She was 7 and didn't have the vocabulary for what she was observing. But she'd started doing a thing where she'd drift into whatever room he was in when she didn't need anything in particular. Just gravitating toward him, sitting near him. He recognized it as what it was, a kid recalibrating her sense of whether the person she depended on was actually going to stay in the room. It broke his heart a little, recognizing that, and it made him more determined. He'd also started writing again. Not in any organized way at first, just a notebook he'd found in a box in his closet, left over from a version of himself that had believed, at 24, that he was going to write seriously someday. He'd started by making notes about the motorcycle, technical observations about what was wrong and what he was doing to fix it. Then somehow the notes drifted into other things he'd been carrying, the way the Jakarta collapse had felt from the inside. The particular exhaustion of being the person everyone relies on while you're running out of the thing they're relying on. The strange peace of sitting in a parking garage with your kid and a broken engine. He didn't have any ambitions for it. It wasn't going anywhere. But the act of finding language for things that had been wordless and pressurized for years felt like releasing air from something that had been inflating too long. He wrote in the mornings after he dropped Sophie off at the kitchen table with bad coffee, and he didn't think about whether it was good. He thought about Victoria, not in the consuming way he'd thought about her before, That low-grade constant current of her that had run under everything in those last months at Caldwell. The kind of want that gets corrosive when you can't act on it. This was different, steadier. He thought about her the way you think about someone who knows where you are, with a kind of settled awareness that didn't need to be resolved immediately. They'd been talking. Not every day, not in any structured way, but since the night she'd shown up at his door, they'd been in loose and genuine contact. Text messages, occasionally a call. She'd told him about the board's reaction to the new quarterly projections. He told her about the carburetor. She'd sent him a photograph of her desk buried under what she described as the physical manifestation of Q4, and he'd sent back a photo of his grease-covered hands next to the disassembled engine, and she'd replied, "I genuinely can't tell which of us has the worst problem." It made him smile, reading that, which was new, smiling at his phone instead of staring at it with the low dread of someone waiting for the next crisis. He was not healed, not completely. He didn't think healing was the kind of thing that arrived all at once and announced itself. But he was better. He could feel the difference in the quality of his mornings, in the way he slept, in the way he moved through a day without the particular tightness that had lived in his chest for so long. He'd stopped noticing it until it began to ease. Victoria, in those same December weeks, started therapy. She'd been thinking about it since the conversation with Renata, and she'd been not doing it for the same reasons. She'd not done many things in her life that required her to sit in a room and be accountable for her interior. She was good at working through problems when the problems were external. She was less good at the ones that lived inside the machinery. The therapist's name was Dr. Soo-Jin Park, and she had an office in a building 12 blocks from Caldwell, with plants on every available surface, and a specific talent for asking the kind of question that sounded simple and wasn't. Their first session, Victoria had given a concise, well-organized summary of why she was there: the emotional unavailability, the difficulty with vulnerability, the tendency to treat her relationships the way she treated operational problems. And Dr. Park had listened to all of it and then said, "Tell me about your relationship with being needed." Victoria had opened her mouth and then closed it again. "Take your time," Dr. Park said. It took her the better part of that session, and most of the next two, to work through what was in that question. What she found, which was not a surprise exactly, but was still uncomfortable to see clearly, was that she had structured her entire adult life around being the person in the room who didn't need anything from anyone. She'd read this as strength for so long, the capability, the self-sufficiency, the wall. And what she was beginning to understand was that it was also a way of staying safe. If you never needed anything, you could never be failed. "And has that worked?" Dr. Park asked. "In professional terms? And personally?" A long pause. "I've been sitting in my car in parking garages, unable to make myself go home." Dr. Park nodded in the way she nodded when something landed accurately. "What does home feel like?" Victoria thought about her apartment, the clean surfaces and the city view, and the careful impersonality of a place that looked like someone lived there without quite giving them away. "Like somewhere I'm staying," she said, "not somewhere I live." "What would somewhere you live look like?" She thought about Ethan's apartment, the horse drawing on the refrigerator, Kevin the rabbit, the lamp in the corner, the kitchen table where they'd sat drinking chamomile tea while the storm outside worked itself out, and the specific quality of quiet that had been there. Not the quiet of her apartment, which was empty, but the quiet of a place that was usually full and was resting. She didn't say that. She filed it somewhere and said, "I don't know yet." "That's okay," Dr. Park said. "That's actually okay." In early January, Victoria did something she had been thinking about since November. She called a meeting with HR, legal, and her CFO, and she proposed the creation of a new senior position at Caldwell, Director of Employee Well-Being and Culture. Not a checkbox role, not the kind of thing that large companies created in response to bad press, and then staffed with someone whose real job was to handle complaints and avoid liability. A real position with authority and budget and a direct line to the executive team, specifically designed to do what no one had done for Ethan or for the dozens of people at every level of the company who had quietly ground themselves into dust in service of quarterly targets. The CFO had questions about the budget. "We spent 43% more on replacement recruitment last year than we did in 2021, Victoria said. "Turnover cost us an estimated $2 million in lost institutional knowledge and project delays alone." The position pays for itself if it prevents even half of that. The CFO had fewer questions after that. She drafted the job description herself. She took longer on it than she'd taken on most documents in her professional life because she wanted it to be real and not just words on a page. She wrote it and rewrote it, and somewhere in the third draft she realized she was writing it with a specific person in mind, thinking about what the person she'd watched burn down slowly would have needed from a company, what would have made a difference. She sent Ethan a text that evening. I'm building something. I want to tell you about it when you're ready to hear it. No pressure, just when you're ready. He texted back 20 minutes later. Tell me now. She called him instead of texting, and she explained the position, what she wanted it to be, what she thought it could do, why she'd come to it. She talked for about 10 minutes before she realized she'd been doing all the talking. Ethan, I'm here. You're quiet. I'm listening. A pause. Keep going. So she kept going. She told him about the data she'd looked at, the turnover numbers, the exit interview patterns, the specific ways the company had been eating its own people without quite realizing it. She told him about the conversation she'd had with Dr. Park, not in detail, not the personal architecture of it, but the structural insight, that she'd built Caldwell in her own image, which meant she'd built it for someone who could survive without needing anything, and that was a very small and unhappy category of person. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That's a real thing, he said. What you're describing, it's not a PR gesture. I know, that's why I'm describing it to you. You want me to take the position. I want you to consider it. When you're ready, there's no timeline. She paused. I mean that. I'm not trying to get you back in the building. I'm trying to build something that should have existed before you ever got as close to the edge as you got. Another pause. Longer. She waited. Can I think about it? Yes? I'm not saying no. I know. I'm saying I need time to figure out if I can go back into that environment and stay healthy in it. Whether what I've been doing the last few months is portable or whether it would fall apart the minute I walked back into those meetings. That's a reasonable thing to figure out. And, he paused, I need to be honest with you about something. Okay? Part of why I left wasn't just the burnout. His voice was measured and careful and real. Part of it was that staying in that building he stopped. While things were the way they were between us was making everything worse. The wanting something you can't have on top of everything else. He exhaled. It was a lot. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I know, she said, I know it was. I'm sorry I let it stay unspoken for so long. You don't have to apologize. I want to. I was a coward about it. He didn't argue with that, which she appreciated. Things are different now, he said. Yes. So I'm not saying the position, and he stopped, started again. I'm not saying the two things are separate. I'm saying I need to know I'm coming back for the right reasons, and that I can handle it. What would help you figure that out? He thought about it. A conversation, in person, about both things. About the job and about a pause. About everything. Okay. Not yet, maybe in a few weeks. Whenever you're ready. He said goodnight, and she sat in her apartment for a while after the call ended, feeling something that took her a moment to identify because she wasn't used to it. Hope that didn't feel reckless. Hope with roots in something actual. She'd spent a lot of her professional life operating on certainty, on the conviction that she could analyze a situation well enough to make outcomes predictable, and she'd learned to distrust hope because it had always felt like the absence of analysis. This felt different. She'd done the work. She'd looked at herself clearly enough to scare herself. She'd built a real thing in response to a real failure. And she was being honest, for maybe the first time in a very long time, about what she wanted. That was not nothing. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early February, Ethan texted her. The motorcycle runs. Sophie says you should come see it. Victoria looked at the message for a moment and texted back. When? Now, if you want. She drove over. The motorcycle was in the parking garage, and it ran. It ran badly, with a cough and a rattle that suggested there was still work to do. But it turned over and idled, and Sophie stood beside it with her arms crossed, and the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had contributed to a project primarily by being present during it. It sounds sick, Sophie told Victoria by way of greeting. It does, Victoria agreed. Is that a problem? Daddy says it just needs more time. He's probably right. Sophie looked at her with the frank and unnerving directness of a 7-year-old. Are you his friend? Yes, Victoria said. Like a work friend or a regular friend? Regular, Ethan said from behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. She's a regular friend, Soph. Sophie considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. Then she said, Okay, do you want to see my horse book? I would genuinely like that, Victoria said. They went upstairs, all three of them, and Sophie spent 25 minutes explaining the horse book in comprehensive detail. Breeds, temperaments, which ones were good for beginners, which ones were difficult. And Victoria sat at the kitchen table and listened with complete attention, and Ethan made coffee, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window the way afternoon light does in February, pale and brief, and not quite warm, but trying. It wasn't anything declared or resolved. It was just three people in an apartment on a Saturday, which was both very small and, depending on where you'd started, quite far from nothing. The conversation Victoria had asked for, about the job and about everything, happened 2 Sundays later, in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his building. They talked for 3 hours. They covered the position in real detail, the scope of it, what authority it would have, what success would look like. Ethan asked questions that were sharp and practical and told her he'd been thinking about it, that he had a list of things that had to be true for him to consider it, and he went through them one by one without apology. She said yes to most of them. On 2 of them, she said she'd have to work through the organizational implications, which he accepted as an honest answer. And then, with the coffee cups mostly empty and the Sunday afternoon crowd thinning out around them, Ethan set down his pen and looked at her across the table in the way that meant they were switching tracks. I've been thinking about this other thing, he said. I know. I'm not all the way there. I want to be honest about that. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment. I think I can figure it out in the context of something real, though. Not in a vacuum. I've spent too long making decisions in a vacuum. Victoria held his gaze. So what are you saying? I'm saying... He stopped, picked up his coffee cup even though it was empty. I'm saying I want to try, whatever that looks like. Slowly. With honesty when things are hard. Things are hard, which they will be, because everything worth having is hard in some way. That's a very carefully worded thing to say. I'm a careful person. You drove 4 states with a 4-year-old and a cracked mirror and a car seat she'd outgrown. He looked caught off guard for a half-second, then almost smiled. How do you know about the car seat? You mentioned it once, a long time ago. She paused. I remember most of what you tell me. I always have. The almost smile became a real one, tired and real and nothing like a performance. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. He set the empty cup down. Okay, let's try. Outside, the February air was cold, and the city was doing what cities do. Indifferent, relentless, moving. And 2 people walked out of a coffee shop and stood on the sidewalk for a moment without quite knowing what came next, and that not knowing felt, for once, like the beginning of something rather than the weight of everything unresolved. It was not a perfect moment. His jacket had a fraying sleeve and she still had 300 unread emails, and Sophie was home with a babysitter who charged by the hour, and neither of them had slept enough. They were 2 imperfect people standing on a cold street with a history that was complicated and a future that was entirely unclear. But they were standing there together, and they both meant it, and some days that is enough. Spring arrived the way it always does after a hard winter. Not triumphantly, not all at once, but in increments. A warm afternoon here. A tree doing something tentative with its branches there. The city slowly remembering that it knew how to be something other than gray. Ethan started at Caldwell again on the first Monday of March, and it was strange in the way that returning to any place you've left under difficult circumstances is always strange, familiar and foreign at the same time. Like a word you've said so many times, it stops sounding like a word. He took the elevator instead of the stairs. He had a different office on a different floor, smaller than his old one, and with a window that faced the parking garage instead of the skyline, and he'd arranged it himself over the previous Friday with a coffee from the place around the corner and no particular ceremony. His title was Director of Employee Well-Being and Culture. His budget was real. His authority was direct. Victoria had made sure of both those things before she'd asked him a second time, because she'd understood that what had broken him before was not the work itself, but the combination of being load-bearing in a structure that didn't acknowledge the weight it was placing on him. and she wasn't willing to build the same trap a second time and call it something new. The first morning, Marcus found him in the fourth-floor kitchen at 7:40, standing at the coffee machine. "Mr. Brooks." Marcus was visibly containing something. "Ethan." "Ethan." He seemed to find this physically difficult. "Welcome back." "Thank you, Marcus. How are you doing?" Marcus blinked. This was apparently not a question he was accustomed to being asked in the kitchen at 7:40. "I'm fine. Good. Busy." "When's the last time you took a vacation day?" Another blink. October, I think." "Let me know if that starts to feel like too long." Ethan picked up his coffee. "That's kind of what I'm here for now." He watched Marcus process this, and then walk away with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had expected a normal Monday and gotten something else. Ethan drank his coffee and looked around the kitchen, the bulletin board with its layers of overlapping announcements, the microwave someone had given up cleaning sometime around 2019, the handwritten note above the sink that said, "Please label your food with the word please." Underlined twice as though politeness would eventually work where reason had failed, and felt tentatively like he was in the right place for the right reasons. That was new. That was worth noticing. The work itself turned out to be harder than he'd expected, and he'd expected it to be hard. The challenge wasn't the concept. The concept was clear to him in a way that felt almost physical, because he'd lived it. The challenge was the institutional resistance, the particular cultural gravity of a company that had spent 30 years rewarding endurance and calling it dedication. People at Caldwell had a complicated relationship with the idea that their well-being was something the company owed them. They'd been trained subtly and persistently to treat needing anything as a weakness, and that training ran deep. His first month, he held listening sessions on every floor, small groups, no cameras, no HR representatives, just him and 10 or 12 people in a conference room with the explicit promise that nothing said there would find its way into a performance review. The first 2 sessions were stilted and cautious, people giving him the polished version of their experience that they'd learned to give in official settings. By the 3rd session, something broke open. A woman in accounts named Diane, 43 years old, 18 years at the company, started talking about the year she'd lost her mother while managing 2 major project deadlines, and how she'd taken 4 days of bereavement leave and come back to 3 weeks of backlogged work, and a manager who had mentioned, with apparent kindness, that she might want to think about whether she was still bringing her best performance. Diane had never told anyone that story at work. She told it haltingly, and then firmly, and when she finished, the room was quiet in a way that meant other people were holding similar things. After that session, Ethan sat in his small office for a long time. He wrote in his notebook, "The problem isn't that people are breaking. The problem is that we've made breaking invisible." He stared at that sentence and then added, "The cost of pretending you're fine is that eventually you actually can't tell the difference." He knew something about that. His relationship with Victoria, their relationship, which was a word they'd started using without quite announcing that they'd decided to use it, was not simple, which they'd both known it wouldn't be. The professional dimension was genuinely complicated. They'd made agreements before he came back. No decision-making that required one of them to prioritize the relationship over their judgment. No closed-door conversations that looked different from the ones either of them would have with any other senior colleague. No letting the personal become a reason to pull punches in the professional. These were real commitments and not costless ones. There were moments when it was hard to be in a meeting room disagreeing about something and then walk out and be something else to each other. There were moments when the emotional shorthand they'd built made professional distance feel almost artificial. But they both held to it because they'd both seen what happened when the line dissolved. Not to other people, but to themselves. They knew from the inside how easy it was to let one overwhelming thing eat everything else. They were not willing to do that again, to each other or to themselves. So they were careful. They were honest when the careful slipped. They had difficult conversations in his apartment kitchen on Wednesday evenings when Sophie was at an after-school program, and sometimes those conversations ended with something resolved, and sometimes they ended with one of them saying, "I need to sit with this for a few days," and the other one saying, "Okay," and meaning it. There were times Victoria said something thoughtless about his availability and caught herself mid-sentence and said, "That was the old pattern. Let me try that again." There were times Ethan went quiet in a way that meant he was retreating and had to make himself name it out loud instead of just disappearing into politeness. They were not a perfect couple. They were not trying to be a perfect couple. They were trying to be two people who had both spent too long being unknowable, learning to be known. Sophie was the variable. Neither of them could fully anticipate. She was not a difficult child, but she was perceptive in the unnerving way of kids who have grown up paying close attention to adult behavior because adult behavior has historically been relevant to their stability. She noticed when her dad was anxious. She noticed when he laughed at something on his phone and his whole face changed. She noticed Victoria's coffee cup appearing in their dish rack on weekday mornings with increasing regularity without anyone explaining to her what that meant. She didn't ask directly. She circled it in the way she circled most things she was working out, coming at it from angles, gathering information. She asked her dad once, apropos of apparently nothing, if Victoria was going to come to her school play. Ethan had said he didn't know. Sophie had said okay, and gone back to her drawing. The next time Victoria came over for dinner, she'd started coming for dinner sometimes, once a week or so, at Sophie's vague but persistent invitation. Sophie waited until they were washing dishes afterward and said, without looking up from the glass she was drying, "Do you like my dad?" Victoria looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Victoria. Some kind of quick and wordless negotiation happened between them. "Yes," Victoria said, "a lot." Sophie put the glass in the cabinet. "Is he your boyfriend?" "Soph," Ethan started. "It's a reasonable question," Victoria said. She looked at Sophie. "We're figuring that out. It's complicated." Sophie considered this. "My teacher says complicated usually means yes, but you're scared." A short silence. "Your teacher is pretty smart," Ethan said. Sophie looked between them with the expression of someone who has received the information they were looking for and is now filing it appropriately. "Okay," she said. "Can I watch the horse documentary?" She went to the living room. Ethan stood at the sink and didn't quite look at Victoria for a moment. Victoria stood beside him and didn't quite look at him either. "Complicated usually means yes, but you're scared," she said quietly. "She's 7. She's right." He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. "I know," he said. And something settled between them. Not dramatically, not with music or declaration, just the small, dense weight of something true landing in a place it was supposed to land. Summer came. The Honda Shadow was running smoothly by June, which Ethan marked not with any celebration, but by taking it out early on a Saturday morning while the city was still quiet, a 20-minute ride to nowhere in particular, and coming back slightly exhilarated and vaguely surprised at himself. He stood in the parking garage afterward feeling the engine heat, and thinking about the version of himself who'd bought this thing for $400, and a fence agreement and needed something broken and fixable, and how the project had worked in exactly the way he'd needed it to. Not because he'd fixed the motorcycle so much as because fixing the motorcycle had let him fix other things alongside it. He told Victoria about the ride over the phone that night. She said, "I want to see it run eventually. You can come with me sometime, if you want." A pause. "I don't know how to ride a motorcycle." "I didn't either until about 4 months ago. There's a class." Another pause, longer, and then she laughed. Not her professional laugh, which was measured and brief, but the real one, surprised out of her, a little undignified. He'd been hearing that laugh more often lately. He thought it was one of the better sounds he knew. The work at Caldwell was producing visible results by mid-year. The first things Ethan had pushed for were structural, a genuine mental health support benefit with real coverage and zero reporting requirements back to the company, a policy that capped mandatory after-hours contact, except in actual emergencies with a specific definition of what constituted an emergency, a redesign of the performance review system to remove metrics that effectively penalize people for taking leave they were entitled to. These were not radical proposals. They were not complicated to implement. The fact that none of them had existed before was, in itself, a kind of answer to the question of how Caldwell had gotten where it had gotten. He also started a quarterly conversation series, informal, open to everyone, no slides, no agenda, where senior leaders, including Victoria, talked about mistakes they'd made and what they'd learned from them. Not the polished retrospective version of mistakes, the actual ones. The first session, Victoria talked about the Jakarta expansion not as a strategic misfire, but as a personal failure of attention. about how she'd been so focused on the outcome that she'd stopped seeing the people building it, and about what that had cost. She said Ethan's name in the context of this, acknowledged what his departure had forced her to confront, and didn't make it tidy or resolved. She just told it the way it had been. The room was very quiet during that. After the session, a woman from the logistics team who Ethan didn't know well found him in the hallway and said, "I've been here 9 years, and that's the first time I've heard someone at that level say they got something wrong and actually mean it." Ethan thanked her and went back to his office and wrote that down too. The turnover numbers at the end of Q2 were the lowest they'd been in 4 years. I didn't present this as a victory because it felt premature to call anything a victory when the work was ongoing and the culture was stubborn. And there were still managers on the third floor who ran their teams with the particular cheerful aggression of people who had never been asked to do it differently. But it was a real number, and it meant something. Victoria texted him when she saw the report. "You're doing it." He texted back, "We're doing it." She sent back a single period, which was her version of smiling without performing it, and he'd learned that about her and found it, consistently, one of his favorite things. The notebook filled up. He bought another one, then another. By the fall, he had 4 of them in various stages of completion, all written in the same cramped handwriting that Sophie made fun of because she'd learned cursive in school and considered his version inferior. He wasn't writing the motorcycle maintenance notes anymore. Those had given way to something that was harder to categorize. Part personal, part professional, part something else that didn't have a clean name. Stories, maybe. Observations. The kinds of things you accumulate when you've been paying attention to human beings under pressure for a few years, and you've been one of them yourself. He showed Victoria one page once, not asking for feedback, just letting her see. She read it slowly and didn't say anything for a moment, and then said, "You should do something with this." "I'm not sure what I'd do with it." "I don't know either, but it's not nothing. It's really not nothing." He put the notebook away, but he kept writing. Well, October brought Sophie's 8th birthday, which she celebrated with a party at a local farm that had horses, obviously, inevitably, because she had been building toward this moment since she first learned the word equestrian, and which required Ethan to spend 2 days coordinating with 8-year-old's parents, and sourcing a cake shaped like a horse that turned out to be both expensive and structurally ambitious, and which was by any objective measure chaotic and too loud, and ran 40 minutes over schedule. Victoria came. She stood at the fence, watching Sophie and 3 of her friends take turns on a small and extremely patient pony, and the look on her face was one that Ethan had not seen before. Not the careful professional composure, not the warmth she'd learned to let out in controlled increments, but something unguarded and a little undone. Like she was watching something that was making her feel things she hadn't made room for before. He stood beside her at the fence. "You okay?" "Yes?" She paused. "She's fearless." About horses specifically. About most things she's terrified. She doesn't look terrified. She is, though. She was afraid to get on the first time. She stood there for 4 minutes and then decided the being afraid was less interesting than the horse. He watched his daughter, who was apparently discussing something with the pony at close range. She always does that. She gets to a point where curiosity beats fear. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "She gets that from you." "I don't know about that." "You drove to Jakarta 3 times on a deal that kept falling apart." "That was stubbornness." "Same thing, sometimes." She looked at him. "You left the job. You fixed the motorcycle. You came back." She paused. "You showed up." He looked back at her. The farm smell and the October light, and Sophie still having an earnest conversation with the pony. "You showed up in the rain." "I showed up in the rain," she agreed. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, and the thing that passed between them in the quiet was not romantic in the conventional sense. It was not dramatic or cinematic or accompanied by any external signal that something significant was happening. It was just 2 people standing at a fence at a birthday party, having arrived at a place that had taken 3 years of avoidance and 1 rainy night and many imperfect months of actual work to reach. The conversation about the house happened in December. Victoria had been thinking about moving for almost a year. Her apartment had served its purpose, the clean lines and the city view, and the deliberate impersonality of a place that telegraphed success without revealing anything about the person who lived there. She'd understood it better, after therapy, as what it actually was, the the physical version of the wall she'd built around herself. She'd needed it once. She didn't need it the same way anymore. She'd found a house in a neighborhood that was neither fashionable nor run down, with a backyard and a second floor and a kitchen that needed work. She'd looked at it twice before she said anything to anyone, and on the third visit she walked through every room slowly and stood in the backyard in the December cold for a long time thinking about what it was she actually wanted. She knew what she wanted. She told Ethan about the house on a Sunday, at his kitchen table, which had become the place where they had most of their real conversations. Something about the particular quality of that table, its ordinariness and its cup rings, and its positioning under the window, that made it easier to say things that mattered. "I've been thinking about asking you something," she said, "and I want to be clear that the answer no is a completely acceptable answer. I mean that." He looked at her steadily. "Okay. I want to ask you and Sophie to move in with me." She said it simply. "Not because I think it fixes anything or makes anything easier, because I want a life that has you in it in a real way. Both of you." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "The house has a backyard," she added, "which I recognize is, Soph's been asking about a backyard for 2 years." "I know." He looked up. "You know that's almost manipulative." "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you anyway." A long pause. "What does real way mean to you?" he asked. "I need to understand what you're actually saying." "I'm saying I want to come home to you. I'm saying I want Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator. I'm saying I want the horse book on the nightstand and Kevin the rabbit somewhere underfoot, and the occasional terrible thing you cook when you think you're being adventurous." She paused. "I'm saying I've spent my whole adult life building something to come home to, and I built all the wrong things. And I think, I'm not certain, but I think that this is the right thing." Ethan sat with that. "You're not certain?" "No." "That's the most honest thing you could have said." "I know." She looked at him. "Are you certain?" He thought about the parking garage floor, and the turned-off phone, and the cold cereal, and Sophie asking if Victoria was his girlfriend, and the motorcycle, and the notebooks, and the listening sessions, and Diane's 18 years, and the rainy night, and the chamomile tea. He thought about everything that had broken, and everything that had been built in the breaking. "No," he said. "But I'm not uncertain either." He paused. "I think there's a place between those two things where you just decide. You look at what you have, and you decide it's worth building on." He looked at her. "I've been deciding that for a while." She let out a slow breath. "I'll talk to Sophie," he said. He talked to Sophie that night at bedtime, sitting on the edge of her mattress with the horse book closed on the nightstand and Kevin tucked under her arm. "I want to ask you something important," he said. She looked at him with the seriousness she reserved for things she sensed were actually serious. "Victoria found a house. She wants to know if we would want to live there with her." He paused. "You don't have to say yes. We can stay here if you want. It's your choice too." Sophie was quiet for a moment. He watched her working through it, the small crease between her brows that meant she was thinking harder than she looked. "Does the house have a yard?" "It has a backyard." "Can I get a dog?" "We're not starting with that question." "But eventually?" "Sophie." She pulled Kevin tighter against her chest. "I like Victoria," she said, carefully, like she was measuring the weight of the sentence. "I know." "Does she like me?" He looked at his daughter. "Very much, yeah." She was quiet again. Then, "Does she know about Kevin?" "She knows about Kevin." "Does she know he's not negotiable?" "I'll make sure she knows he's not negotiable." Sophie looked at the ceiling. A long pause. Then, "Okay." "Okay?" "Okay, we can move." She said it with the particular matter-of-factness of a child who has finished thinking and moved to conclusion. "But I want to pick my room." "That's reasonable." "And Kevin gets his own shelf." "I'll negotiate that." She turned over and pulled the blanket up, conversation apparently concluded. He sat on the edge of the mattress for another minute and felt the weight of the moment. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just full, like a room with the right things in it. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He thought about it, really thought about it, the way the question deserved. "Getting there," he said. "Yeah, I think I am." She made a sound that was either satisfaction or the beginning of sleep, and he turned off the lamp and let himself sit in the dark for a moment. Getting there. That was the truest thing he knew. They moved in February, on a Saturday that was cold and disorganized and involved a rental truck that was smaller than it needed to be, and a couch that did not fit through the front door on the first 4 attempts, and Sophie directing operations from the front step with the authority of someone who had watched one too many home renovation shows. Victoria had taken the day off work for the first time in recent memory for a reason that was not a crisis, and she stood in the middle of what was going to be the living room surrounded by boxes and said, to no one in particular, "I've never moved for a reason I actually wanted before." Ethan set a box down on the floor beside her. "Is that strange?" "Very." She looked around the room, the walls that needed paint, the windows that let in good light, the boxes with Sophie's name written in crayon because Sophie had insisted on labeling her own. "Good strange, but strange. You'll get used to it. I know." She looked at him. "I think I might be good at it, actually, given enough practice." "You're good at most things you practice. Stop being reasonable. This is an emotional moment." He picked the box back up. "Kevin gets the shelf in Sophie's room. Non-negotiable, per her." "Obviously non-negotiable. I already bought the shelf." He stopped. "You already—" "Last week. It's in the car." She picked up a box with the decisiveness of someone who was done having the conversation. "Now help me figure out what we're doing about that couch. Here is what nobody tells you about rebuilding a life. It does not feel like a revelation. It does not arrive with clarity or resolution or the clean satisfaction of a thing completed. What it feels like is incremental and ordinary and occasionally exhausting and shot through when you're paying attention, with moments of such specific rightness that you have to stop what you're doing and just let yourself have them. It feels like a Saturday morning in a house that still smells like paint and cardboard, with coffee going in the kitchen and Sophie's voice carrying from upstairs where she is having a detailed conversation with Kevin about whether he prefers his new shelf. It feels like a motorcycle in the parking garage that runs now, that started broken and became something else through patience and attention and a willingness to sit with difficulty until you understood it. It feels like a notebook filled with the handwriting of someone who learned, later than he should have, that his interior life was worth the same care as his professional one. It feels like two people who told themselves for years that they were fine, and one day stopped believing it, and had the particular courage, not dramatic courage, not movie courage, just the ordinary grinding kind, to do something about it. Ethan Brooks at 34 did not look like the man who had slid a resignation letter under a door at 6:47 in the morning and walked down 4 flights of stairs to a parking lot to sit in his car and feel nothing. He looked like a man who had been somewhere difficult and come back from it changed in the specific ways that difficulty changes you when you let it. He still got tired. He still sometimes caught himself slipping back into the patterns that had broken him. The overcommitting, the underasking, the treating his own limits as problems to be solved instead of facts to be respected. He was not cured of any of that. But he could see it now, which was different from before. Before, he couldn't see it at all. Victoria Hayes at 32 did not look like the CEO who had sat in a dark office while her motion sensors gave up and stared at a city that felt like a performance she was giving for an empty theater. She looked like someone who was still formidable, that had not changed, would not change, was not the part that had needed changing, but whose formidability was now connected to something underneath it. She'd stopped confusing the wall with the person behind it. She had not dismantled the wall. She'd just learned that sometimes it was okay to open a door in it. She was not all the way healed either. She still had weeks where the old anxiety came back hard, where she defaulted to control and overwork, and the particular coldness that had protected her so long it had become habitual. She still sometimes needed Dr. Park to ask her an uncomfortable question that she should have been able to ask herself. She was still learning, imperfectly, that vulnerability was not the absence of strength, but a different and harder form of it. But she was learning. That was the thing. She was actually learning. On a Sunday evening in the spring, a year after they'd moved in, Ethan was on the back porch of the house with the notebook he'd been writing in for 2 years. Sophie was inside, video calling a school friend about something that had apparently required her to move to a different room 3 times for better signal. Victoria was sitting across from him with a glass of wine and the draft of a proposal she was reviewing, which she set down after a few minutes without finishing it. "Can I read something?" she asked. He looked up. "What?" "In the notebook." She nodded toward it. "Can I read something?" He looked at the notebook in his hand. He'd been writing about the listening sessions, about Diane and her 18 years, and the story about her mother, and the particular cost of the economy of silence that had built up inside Caldwell, like sediment. He'd been writing about what he'd learned and what it had meant, and how he'd come to believe that the most important thing a company could do was create conditions in which people were allowed to be truthful about what was happening to them. He held it out to her. She read for several minutes. He watched her face while she read, the slight tightening around her eyes when something hit somewhere specific, the way she went still when she got to the part about Diane. When she finished, she held the notebook in her hands for a moment without giving it back. Ethan. Yeah. This should be a book. He shook his head. It's just notes. Stop. She looked at him with the particular focused directness of a person who sees something clearly and is not in the mood for deflection. I'm not saying it to compliment you. I'm saying it because people need to read this. Not executives in a seminar. Regular people in jobs who are running out of themselves and don't have the language for it. She paused. You have the language for it. He looked at the backyard, the grass that needed cutting, the fence they'd painted together last October, the corner where Sophie had declared she was going to plant a garden and then lost interest 2 weeks in, but the seeds had come up anyway. Something had come up anyway. I'll think about it, he said. You'll do more than think about it. You're not my boss. In this area, I kind of am. He looked at her, and she looked back, and the evening light was doing what evening light does in spring. And it was not a perfect moment because there were no perfect moments, only real ones. And this was real in every dimension, the uncut grass and the wine and the notebook, and Sophie's voice drifting through the window, and the year they'd built in this house, and the years before that which had been harder and were also, in the way of hard things that teach you something, worth having. Okay, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Okay, I'll do more than think about it. She nodded and picked her proposal back up. He opened the notebook to a new page. There is a version of this story that wants to end with everything resolved, a tidy final chapter where the grief is healed, and the company is transformed, and the family is complete, and the hard work is done. But anyone who has actually done hard work knows that's not how it ends. It doesn't end. You don't finish healing. You don't complete a culture change. You don't arrive at the version of yourself you always meant to be and set down your bags and stop. What you do is keep choosing it. You choose to notice when you're drifting back into the patterns that cost you. You choose to say the thing that's hard to say instead of the thing that's easier. You choose to let someone in when everything in your history says to close the door, because you've learned, finally, slowly, at some cost, that the door was never protecting you as much as you thought. You choose to sit on the porch on a Sunday evening with the notebook and the wine and the sound of your kid inside and the person next to you who knows you at your worst and thinks you're worth knowing anyway. You choose, again and again, the life you actually want over the life you defaulted into. Ethan Brooks had not become someone new. He'd become more accurately himself, the person who'd been there under all the overwork and the silence and the years of giving everything to a job while his own life waited for him to have time for it. He was still the man who worried about Sophie's loneliness and cried at the horse documentary she made him watch 3 times. He was still the man who kept notes in a cramped handwriting his daughter mocked. He was just also, now, a man who knew what those things meant and honored them accordingly. Victoria Hayes had not become someone new either. She was still the woman who could hold a boardroom with the force of pure preparation and precision, who still occasionally arrived at the dinner table running a problem in the back of her head and had to make herself close that window and be present. She was still wary in the way that people who learned early that safety was conditional tend to remain wary. She was just also, now, a woman who understood that wariness was not the same as wisdom, and that the life she wanted was not behind a wall but on the other side of one. Sophie was 8 and then 9 and growing into herself with the inexorable momentum of a kid who had decided, on some fundamental level, that curiosity was going to beat fear every time. She didn't know the whole story, the resignation letter and the rainy night and the parking garage and the long months of working out what it meant to be honest about yourself when you'd spent years being very successful at not being. She knew that her dad had a motorcycle and a notebook and a job he cared about. She knew that Victoria had bought Kevin his own shelf without being asked. She knew that the house had a backyard where something had come up even when nobody was paying attention. She knew that was enough. It was. 39 floors of steel and glass, The Sinclair Dynamics logo etched into the marble lobby, the same security guards at the front desk. Mason badged in and felt the click of the turnstile like a clock resetting. But it wasn't the same. He wasn't the same. The elevator opened on 39, and there was Derek, leaning against the reception desk with a coffee in each hand. He straightened when he saw Mason and broke into a grin so wide it rearranged his entire face. The prodigal son returns. Don't call me that. The prodigal executive? The prodigal... Derek. Fine. Here. He thrust a coffee at Mason. Rachel made me buy it. She said if I showed up without a welcome back coffee, she'd reassign my parking spot. She can do that now? She can do everything now. She's terrifying. You'd be proud. They walked together toward the new office that had been set up for Mason. Not his old one, which had been absorbed into the integration team's space, but a smaller room on the opposite side of the floor. Window view, modest desk, a plant that someone had optimistically placed on the sill, despite the building's notoriously poor natural light. The plant's gonna die, Mason said. Rachel picked it out. Don't tell her. I'm not telling her anything. I just got here. His first meeting was at 10, with the full leadership team. Mason had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, with notes and data and a clear agenda. But sitting down at the oval table again, in a different chair than the one he used to occupy, felt strange, like visiting your childhood home after someone else had moved in. The furniture was in different places, but the walls were the same. Rachel sat at the far end, looking polished and slightly exhausted in the way that new authority makes people. Derek was to her left, already fidgeting with his pen. 3 other department heads filled the remaining seats, and at the head of the table, Ava. She looked at him the way she looked at everyone in a professional setting, direct, evaluative, slightly intimidating. But there was something underneath it, visible only if you knew where to look, a softness in the set of her mouth, a warmth in her eyes when they caught his. Welcome back, Mason, she said. Not warm, not cold, calibrated. The floor is yours. He stood, took a breath, and laid out his plan. He'd spent the last 3 weeks building it, not a corporate wellness program cobbled together from industry templates and buzzwords, but something grounded in what he'd actually experienced, what he'd watched other people experience. The slow erosion of identity that happens when work becomes the only thing. The way burnout doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, like carbon monoxide, odorless and invisible, until you're on the floor. He talked about structural changes, mandatory maximum hours for salaried employees, enforced through a tracking system that flagged patterns before they became crises. Mental health resources, not a hotline number buried on page 40 of the employee handbook, but on-site counselors, subsidized therapy, and a culture that treated mental health with the same urgency as a broken leg. He talked about workload audits, quarterly reviews not of performance metrics but of capacity, how much each team was carrying versus how much they could sustainably carry. A system for redistributing work before people hit the wall, instead of waiting for them to crack and then scrambling to fill the gap. And he talked about leadership, about how burnout cascaded from the top down, how a CEO who worked until midnight created a culture where leaving at 6 felt like desertion, how a manager who answered emails at 3 in the morning trained their team to do the same, how the company's greatest liability wasn't a bad quarter or a failed product, but the systematic destruction of the people who made everything possible. He didn't look at Ava when he said this. He didn't have to. The room understood. When he finished, there was silence, the kind of silence that could go either way, the precursor to applause or to pushback. Derek broke it first. So basically, you want to make it impossible for us to work ourselves to death. I want to make it unnecessary. There's a difference. Rachel leaned forward. The workload audits. How do you enforce them without creating a bureaucratic nightmare? Lightweight reporting. Automated where possible. The goal isn't more paperwork, it's better visibility. Right now, nobody knows how much anyone else is carrying until someone collapses. I want to change that. And the mandatory hour limits? That was Mark Chen, head of engineering, a quiet man who'd been at the company longer than anyone. My team is in the middle of a product launch. You're telling me they can't work weekends? I'm telling you that if your team needs to work weekends to launch a product, the timeline is wrong. The answer isn't more hours, it's better planning or pushing the launch. Easy to say from a wellness office, harder when the board is breathing down your neck. I know what it feels like to have the board breathing down your neck, Mark. I also know what it feels like to black out at your desk because you haven't eaten in 14 hours. One of those things is uncomfortable. The other one is dangerous. Mark held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Not agreement, exactly. Acknowledgement. The kind of nod that says, I hear you. I'm not convinced, but I'm listening. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Mason fielded questions, pushback, concerns, and one unexpectedly emotional comment from a woman in HR who said that 3 people in her department had been hospitalized for stress-related conditions in the past year, and nobody talked about it. When it was over, the room emptied slowly, people murmuring to each other. The energy shifted. Not transformed, not overnight, but tilted. Like a wheel that had been stuck was now, just barely, beginning to turn. Ava waited until everyone was gone. Then she closed the door. That was good, she said. You sound surprised. I'm not surprised by the quality. I'm surprised by how it felt. Sitting in that room, listening to you challenge the way this company operates, I kept waiting for the defensive reaction, the part of me that wants to protect the way things are. And it didn't come. Maybe Dr. Navarro is worth the 400 an hour. Don't let her hear you say that. Her ego is already substantial. Ava sat on the edge of the table, a gesture she would never have made in front of others. Too casual, too human. Mason. Yeah? Mark is going to be a problem. He's been here since before my father left, and he sees any change in how we work as a personal criticism. I know. He has allies on the board, Franklin in particular. I know that too. And there will be a moment, maybe soon, maybe in a few months, where you propose something that directly conflicts with a revenue goal or a launch deadline, and people are going to push back hard. Not because they disagree with your principles, but because the principles cost money and time are what they understand. I'm ready for that. Are you? She looked at him with those sharp eyes, and for a second she wasn't his girlfriend or his Saturday companion or the woman who'd eaten his pancakes on the kitchen floor. She was the CEO, assessing, calculating. Because when that moment comes, I may not be able to back you publicly. Not because I don't agree with you, but because the board dynamics require, Ava, I know how this works. I've been in this building for 3 years. I've watched you navigate those dynamics. I don't need you to fight my battles. Then what do you need? Honestly, right now I need lunch. I've been talking for 90 minutes and I forgot to eat breakfast. The tension in her shoulders released. She almost smiled. There's Thai food in the break room. Whose is it? Derek's. Perfect. They ate Derek's Thai food at Mason's new desk, sitting across from each other the way they had 100 times before, but different now. Everything was different now, the dynamic, the distance, the things they were allowed to say and feel and want. Mason ate his pad CEW and watched Ava pick through her green curry with chopsticks she wielded with the precision of a surgeon, and he thought about how strange it was to sit in this building and feel something other than weight. I have something for you, she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small box. Not wrapped, not decorated, just a plain cardboard box about the size of a fist. She set it on the desk. He opened it. Inside, nested in tissue paper, was a key. Old, iron, slightly rusted. Not a modern key. Something antique, with an ornate bow and a long shaft. It's the original key to the cottage, Ava said. I found it in my mother's things. The locksmith said the lock still works, even though we've been using the new deadbolt. Why are you giving me this? Because I want you to have access to the place whether I'm there or not. Because I want Lily to be able to go there whenever she wants. Because... She paused, looked out the window. Because it's not just my space anymore. He held the key in his palm. It was heavy for its size, the iron warm from the box. He closed his fingers around it. Thank you, he said. Don't get sentimental. It's a key. It's more than a key. I know. That's why I said don't get sentimental. One of us has to maintain composure, and it's not going to be you. He put the key in his pocket and went back to his pad CU. But he touched his pocket 3 more times that afternoon, feeling the shape of it through the fabric, the weight of what it meant. The first month was a war of attrition, not the dramatic kind, so no shouting matches or boardroom coups. The quiet kind. The kind where resistance manifests as missed meetings, unreturned emails, passive-aggressive compliance. Mark Chen's engineering team ignored the hour tracking system. Franklin made pointed comments during board calls about overhead and soft initiatives. Two managers in the sales department openly mocked the wellness program in a group chat that someone forwarded to Mason. He read the messages, didn't respond, didn't escalate, just noted the names and the sentiments and kept working. They're going to test you, Rachel told him over coffee in the break room. She'd become an unexpected ally, not because she was inherently sympathetic to the wellness cause, but because she was pragmatic and had seen what burnout did to the bottom line. They want to know if you're serious or if this is a vanity project. It's not a vanity project. I know that. They don't. Prove it with data. Give them numbers they can't argue with. So he did. He spent the first month building a data set that would have made his old analyst self proud. Retention rates, healthcare costs, productivity metrics, sick days, turnover expenses. He cross-referenced the data with industry benchmarks and internal timelines, and he found what he'd suspected. The company was losing more money to burnout-related turnover than it would ever spend on prevention. Not close, not marginal, significantly more. The cost of replacing a mid-level employee, recruiting, hiring, training, lost productivity, was roughly 1.5 times their annual salary. The company had lost 14 employees in the past year alone to burnout or burnout-adjacent resignations. The math was devastating. He presented it to the board in December. Franklin sat stone-faced through the whole thing. Way looked uncomfortable, but the numbers were the numbers, and Mason had learned from Ava that the only language the board truly spoke was financial. So you're saying we've been hemorrhaging talent and money because we work people too hard, Wei said. I'm saying the cost of burning people out far exceeds the cost of preventing it. This isn't a wellness argument, it's a financial one. Franklin leaned back in his chair. And your proposed solutions, the hour limits, the counselors, the workload audits, what's the implementation cost? Mason gave him the number. Franklin blinked. That's a fraction of what we're losing, Rachel said from across the table. I've validated his methodology. The data is sound. Franklin looked at Ava. And you support this? Ava didn't hesitate. Fully. And I'll tell you why. Because we're about to integrate two companies, and if we don't fix the culture now, we'll lose the Whitfield people the same way we lost ours. The merger isn't just about balance sheets, it's about people, and people break. Mason felt something shift in the room. Not a revolution, a crack. The hairline fracture that precedes the break, that lets the light in. Franklin didn't smile, didn't concede, didn't suddenly become a convert to the cause of employee well-being, but he stopped pushing back. And for Franklin, silence was as close to approval as you'd ever get. After the meeting, Mason stood in the hallway waiting for the elevator, and Mark Chen approached him. The older man stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, then at the ceiling, then finally at Mason. My wife told me I should talk to you, Mark said. About what? About the fact that I haven't taken a vacation day in 3 years. About the fact that my oldest daughter called me a stranger at Thanksgiving. He paused. The words seemed to cost him something. I pushed back on your program because it felt like an indictment. Like you were saying I've been doing it wrong. You haven't been doing it wrong. You've been doing what the culture expected. The culture I helped build. Yeah, that too. Mark looked at him, eyes tired, jaw tight. A man carrying something he didn't know how to set down. My daughter is 12. She told my wife that she doesn't bother asking me to come to her soccer games anymore because I always say I'm busy. And the thing is, the thing that kept me up all night, she wasn't angry, she wasn't hurt, she just accepted it, like it was a fact. Like the sky is blue and Dad doesn't come to games. Mason didn't say anything, didn't need to. The silence did the work. Sign me up for the workload audit, Mark said. And the counseling thing, the on-site sessions. How does that work? I'll send you the information, today. Today's fine, thanks. Mark walked away. At the end of the hallway, he paused and turned back. Carter. Yeah? My daughter's name is Sophie. She plays midfield. She's pretty good. Go to her next game, Mark. I'm planning on it. The elevator arrived. Mason stepped in and rode it down to the lobby alone, and somewhere between the 39th floor and the ground, he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and stood very still for a moment. Not crying. Not quite. Just letting the pressure behind his ribs release in the only way the confined space allowed. The small victories accumulated. One manager started leaving at 5:30 and told her team to do the same. Two engineering leads requested the on-site counseling sessions. An anonymous survey, Mason's idea, Rachel's execution, revealed that 63% of employees had considered leaving in the past year due to work-life imbalance. The number was staggering and galvanizing, and Mason printed it on a card and placed it on his desk where he could see it every morning. 63%. That was the number. That was the mission. Meanwhile, his other life, the real one, the one that existed outside fluorescent lighting and quarterly reports, continued to grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. The motorcycle was nearly done. Weekends at the cottage had become their rhythm. Mason and Lily would drive out Saturday morning, sometimes with Ava, sometimes meeting her there after she'd spent the morning at the office, and then pride herself away with what she described as moderate to severe psychological effort. The bike had a new exhaust system, rebuilt brakes, fresh cables, a repainted frame in the original silver that Mason had spent weeks matching from faded photographs he'd found online. The engine was reassembled, the carburetor clean, the electrical system rewired. What remained was the cosmetic work, the seat, the chrome, the final details that would transform it from a mechanical project into something you could actually ride. Lily had appointed herself quality control inspector, a role she invented and took seriously. She would walk around the motorcycle with her hands behind her back, leaning in to examine things with exaggerated focus and then deliver her verdict. The shiny part looks good. That's the exhaust manifold. It looks very shiny. Thank you. That means I cleaned it properly. The seat is still ugly. I haven't replaced the seat yet. When you do, can it be purple? Motorcycle seats aren't purple, Bug. Why not? Because he didn't actually have a reason. I'll think about it. Ava's garden had survived the transition into autumn, which was something of a miracle given her learning curve. The tomatoes were long gone, but she'd planted winter greens, kale, spinach, chard, following a method she'd researched obsessively and executed with the rigid precision of someone who approached gardening the way most people approach surgery. The results were uneven. Some plants thrived, others wilted despite receiving identical care, as if they'd decided individually whether they wanted to participate. "This one's dying," Ava said one Saturday, standing over a kale plant that had gone yellow and limp. "I did everything the same. Same water, same soil, same light. Why is this one dying?" Because plants are living things, and living things don't follow formulas. Everything follows formulas if you identify the right variables. Not everything, not people, not plants, not relationships. She looked at him. "Are we talking about kale or about us?" "Both. The answer's the same." She pulled the dead plant out of the ground and held it, roots dangling, dirt falling from her fingers. "I don't like things that don't follow formulas." "I know, that's the thing you're working on. Don't quote my therapist at me. I'm quoting my therapist, but I suspect they say similar things." She threw the dead kale at him. He caught it. Lily came running around the corner of the cottage with two of the neighbors' chickens in pursuit. "They're following me again." "Stop feeding them bread, Lily." "But they like bread. Everyone likes bread. That doesn't mean you give it to chickens you don't own." December brought cold weather and Lily's school play. Mason sat in the folding chair in the gymnasium, Ava beside him, both of them surrounded by parents who filmed everything on their phones and grandparents who couldn't hear anything, and teachers who stood at the edges looking simultaneously proud and exhausted. Lily was a tree, a very committed tree. She stood on stage in a brown shirt with paper leaves attached to her arms, and when her moment came, she delivered her one line, "The wind is blowing," with a dramatic intensity that suggested years of classical training rather than 6 rehearsals in a school cafeteria. Mason clapped. Ava clapped harder. Afterward, in the lobby, Lily came running up to them with her paper leaves disintegrating and her face flushed with triumph. "Did you hear me? Did you hear my line?" "We heard you, Bug. You were incredible." "I was the best tree." "You were definitely the best tree." "Ava, did you see?" Ava crouched down, always crouching down, always meeting Lily at her level, a habit she'd adopted without being taught. "I saw. You had real presence up there." "What's presence?" "It's when people can't look away from you." "Could you not look away from me?" "Not for a second." Lily beamed. Then she threw her arms around Ava's neck with the total, unguarded abandon that children give to the people they love, and Ava caught her and held on, and Mason stood in the gymnasium lobby, surrounded by 200 other families, and felt his throat close around something he couldn't name. On the drive home, Lily fell asleep in the back seat. Ava drove. She'd gotten marginally better, or at least Mason had gotten better at not gripping the door handle. They rode in comfortable silence until Ava spoke. She hugged me. She does that. She's never done that before. Not like that. Not out of nowhere. Just because she wanted to. That's how Lily works. She decides you're hers and then she acts on it. I didn't know what to do. You hugged her back. That was the right thing. It was instinct. I didn't think about it. My body just reacted. That's called being a person, Ava. She was quiet for a moment. I called my father's facility this morning, before the play. Mason looked at her. You did? I asked if he was having a good day. They said he was sitting in the garden, which apparently is a good sign. I told them to tell him his daughter said hello. She paused. He won't understand it. He won't remember it. But I needed to say it. Why today? Because I was about to sit in an audience and watch a 5-year-old perform, and it occurred to me that my father never once sat in an audience for me. And I wanted to, I don't know, close some kind of loop, tell him I was there, even if he wasn't. Mason reached across the console and took her hand. She held on tight. Lily snored softly in the back seat, her head tilted at an angle that would absolutely result in a sore neck, her paper leaves crumbling against the car seat. Dr. Navarro says I'm making progress, Ava said. What kind of progress? She says I'm learning to tolerate imperfection, that I'm starting to understand that things can be messy and good at the same time. She looked at him. She says the fact that I can sit on a gymnasium floor surrounded by sticky children and actually enjoy it is a significant development. You sat on the floor? Lily wanted to sit on the floor, so I sat on the floor. In those pants? They're dry clean only, I'm aware. Ava Sinclair sitting on a gymnasium floor in dry clean only pants. Dr. Navarro's right, that is progress. She squeezed his hand. Shut up and navigate. I think I missed the turn. You missed the turn 4 blocks ago. Then why didn't you say something? I was enjoying the moment. She made an illegal U-turn with the confidence of someone who'd never received a traffic citation, and they drove home through streets lit with early December decorations. White lights strung between lampposts, wreaths on doors, the particular glow that the city took on as the year wound down. Mason watched it all through the window and felt something he'd been afraid to name for months, afraid that naming it would jinx it or expose it as temporary, as fragile, as another thing the machine would eventually consume. Happiness. Not the manic, fleeting kind. Not the kind that depended on a good quarter or a successful merger or a boss's approval. The slow, steady, imperfect kind. The kind that existed alongside exhaustion and doubt and fear and the daily reality of being a single father and a recovering workaholic and a man in love with a woman who was still learning to let herself be loved. It wasn't perfect. He didn't want it to be. Perfect was a trap. Perfect was his father polishing a motorcycle he never rode. Perfect was Emily's picture of parenthood that shattered the moment it met reality. Perfect was a building with 39 floors full of people destroying themselves in pursuit of something that didn't exist. What he had was real, messy, complicated, held together with duct tape and good intentions and the stubborn refusal to let go. A daughter who played a tree with more passion than most people brought to their entire careers. A woman who threw dead kale and couldn't park and was the most brilliant, infuriating, extraordinary person he'd ever met. A motorcycle in a dead woman's garage that was almost ready to run. That night, after Lily was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and worked on his novel. 53 pages now. Not enough for a book, but enough for a beginning. Enough to know that the story had legs, that the words were leading somewhere, that the voice he'd lost when Emily left and fatherhood consumed him and the company ate the rest. That voice was still there, rougher than before, less confident, but alive. He wrote a scene about a man standing in a garage, looking at something he'd rebuilt with his own hands, and realizing that the thing he'd been restoring wasn't the machine. It was himself. He saved the file, closed the laptop, picked up his phone. Still awake? Ava replied immediately. Finishing a report, leaving in 10 minutes. Don't lecture me. It's 10:47. I said don't lecture me. Good night, Ava. Good night. I had a really good day today. Me too. Your daughter was the best tree. She really was. He put the phone down and went to bed with the taste of something sweet and unfamiliar in his chest. The feeling of a day lived well, in the company of people who mattered, doing work that meant something. Not a perfect day. Lily had thrown a tantrum about broccoli at dinner, and Ava had accidentally backed into a parking meter, and Mason had snapped at a coworker during an afternoon call and had to apologize afterward. The edges were rough. The seams showed. But the thing held together, and that, Mason was learning, was enough. Orchestrated final narrative arc, resolving all plot threads comprehensively. Orchestrated final narrative arc, resolving all plot threads comprehensively. The motorcycle started on a Sunday in March. Mason had been working on it for the better part of the morning, replacing the last of the ignition components, a condenser he'd tracked down from a retired Honda dealer in New Jersey, who'd kept a warehouse full of vintage parts organized by year and model with the devotion of a museum curator. The condenser was small, about the size of a thumb, and it had taken 3 weeks to arrive because the dealer insisted on testing it twice before shipping, which Mason respected even though the weight had nearly driven him insane. Lily was inside the cottage with Ava, the two of them engaged in what Lily called pancake experiments, an ongoing Saturday tradition that had evolved from Ava's disastrous first attempt into something resembling competence, though resembling was doing a lot of heavy lifting. The pancakes were edible now. Sometimes they were even good. Ava tracked her progress in a spreadsheet on her phone, which Mason found both endearing and clinically disturbing. He installed the condenser, checked the connections one more time, checked them again. His hands were steady, but his heart was doing something fast and uneven in his chest, because this was it, the last piece, the final component of a restoration that had taken nearly 3 years, and he was suddenly, irrationally afraid that it wouldn't work. That after all the weekends and the late nights, and the grease-stained fingers, and the hundreds of parts cleaned and replaced and fitted together, the engine would turn over, and cough, and die. And the whole thing would have been an exercise in futility. He sat on the garage floor for a minute, just breathing. The March air was cool through the open door, carrying the smell of the meadow, wet grass, thawing earth, the earliest wildflowers pushing through. Winter was ending. Something was beginning. He turned the key. The engine caught on the second try. A cough, a sputter, then a sound that Mason felt in his bones. A deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the frame and the handlebars, and up through his arms into his chest. The CB350 was alive. After 50 years of silence and 3 years of patient, stubborn work, it was alive. He sat there, straddling the bike, listening to the engine run. It wasn't smooth. There was a slight roughness in the idle, a hesitation between cycles that he'd need to tune out. But it ran. It ran. He didn't realize he was crying until Lily appeared in the garage doorway and said, "Daddy, why is your face wet?" "The motorcycle works, Bug." She looked at the rumbling machine, then at him, then back at the machine. Her expression shifted from curiosity to understanding to a wide, gap-toothed grin. "Can I ride it?" "Absolutely not." "When I'm bigger?" "When you're much bigger." "How much bigger?" "At least this tall." He held his hand about 5 feet off the ground. "That's going to take forever." "Some things are worth waiting for." Ava appeared behind Lily, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stopped. She stared at the motorcycle, running, rumbling, real, and then at Mason, still sitting on it with tears on his face and grease on his shirt, and an expression that was somewhere between triumph and disbelief. "You did it," she said. "We did it. Half those parts were cleaned by you. I helped with the cosmetic components. You did the actual engineering. Don't diminish your contribution. Those chrome pieces didn't polish themselves." She walked to the bike, ran her hand along the gas tank, repainted silver, gleaming under the garage lights. Touched the new leather seat, which was black, not purple, despite Lily's vigorous campaign. Listened to the engine the way she listened to everything, completely, with her whole attention. "It sounds beautiful," she said. "It sounds rough. The idle needs adjusting, and the timing's slightly off. You can hear that stutter on the upstroke. It sounds beautiful because it sounds real, not perfect, real." He cut the engine. The silence that followed was enormous, the way silence always is after something loud. He climbed off the bike and stood next to Ava, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and Lily ran her hand along the exhaust pipe and then pulled it back because it was hot and said a word she'd learned from Derek that Mason pretended not to hear. They ate lunch on the porch. The winter greens from Ava's garden had produced enough for a salad, which she served with the pride of someone presenting a doctoral thesis. The kale was slightly bitter and the spinach was a little tough, and the chard had been attacked by some insect that left lacy holes in half the leaves, and it was the best salad Mason had ever eaten. "This is from our garden," Lily announced, as if Mason might not have been present for the entire growing process. "I know, Bug. Ava grew it." "I know that too. She's good at growing things now." Ava looked at the salad on her plate with an expression that was trying very hard to be modest and failing completely. "I've improved. You killed 4 tomato plants and an entire row of basil. Growth requires sacrifice. That's what you said about the basil. And I was right. The winter greens learned from the basil's mistakes. Plants don't learn from other plants' mistakes, Ava. Mine do. I have a system." Mason looked at his daughter, eating her bitter kale without complaint, and at Ava, defending her garden with the intensity of a courtroom lawyer, and he felt something settle in his chest. Not the sharp, urgent feeling of those early weeks, but something deeper, quieter, like a foundation being laid, stone by stone, beneath a structure that was still being built. Spring arrived properly in April, and with it came the 1-year anniversary of Mason's resignation. He didn't mark it deliberately, no calendar notification, no reflective journal entry, but his body remembered. He woke up on the morning of April 14th with a tightness in his shoulders and a restlessness in his hands that took him 20 minutes to identify as the ghost of a stress response, his nervous system recalling a date that his conscious mind had tried to move past. He went to the office anyway, sat at his desk, opened the wellness program dashboard, a system he'd built with Rachel's team over the winter, tracking the metrics that mattered. Voluntary turnover was down 19% since November. Sick days had decreased by 12%. The anonymous quarterly survey showed a 15-point improvement in employee satisfaction, with the biggest gains in the departments that had adopted the workload audit system. Numbers. Clean, persuasive, undeniable. The kind of data that made Franklin shut up and made Way nod and made the board approve his budget for the next fiscal year without a single objection. But the numbers weren't the part that mattered to Mason. The part that mattered was what happened behind the numbers. The engineering lead who'd started leaving at 5 to coach his son's baseball team. The marketing coordinator who'd used the mental health benefit to get treatment for anxiety. She'd been hiding for 2 years. The administrative assistant who'd come to Mason's office, closed the door, and told him that the on-site counseling had saved her marriage. "I was so deep in the work that I forgot I had a life outside this building," she said. "My husband told me he felt like a roommate. We'd been together 11 years and he felt like a roommate. The counselor helped me see that I was using work to avoid dealing with problems at home, and now we're actually talking. For the first time in years, we're talking." Mason listened and nodded and didn't say much, because what was there to say? He'd been that person. He knew the shape of that story from the inside. The only difference was that nobody had built a program to catch him before he fell. That was the point, he reminded himself. That was the whole point, not the dashboard metrics, or the board presentations, or the budget approvals. The point was one person sitting across from him, saying, "I was drowning, and someone threw me a rope." Mark Chen became, unexpectedly, his strongest ally. The transformation wasn't dramatic. Mark was still gruff, still resistant to what he called feelings talk, still inclined to work long hours out of habit rather than necessity. But he'd gone to his daughter's soccer game, and then another one, and then all of them. And one Monday morning, he'd walked into Mason's office and set a framed photograph on the desk without explanation. In the photo, a 12-year-old girl in a blue jersey was mid-kick, her face fierce with concentration, and on the sideline, barely visible in the background, a man in a folding chair was leaning forward with his hands on his knees, watching her like she was the only person on the field. "Sophie scored twice," Mark said. "I was there for both." Mason kept the photo on his desk. He didn't explain it to anyone who asked. Ava's evolution was slower, harder, and less visible to anyone who didn't know where to look. She still worked too much. She still answered emails at 11 at night, and scheduled calls during what was supposed to be personal time, and occasionally fell into the old pattern of micromanaging decisions that Rachel and Derek were perfectly capable of handling on their own. The difference was that she caught herself, or Mason caught her, or Dr. Navarro caught her at their weekly sessions, which Ava described as voluntary interrogations conducted by a woman with an unsettling talent for silence. She just sits there, Ava told Mason one evening at the cottage, the two of them on the porch with coffee while Lily drew pictures in the yard with the neighbors' chickens as unwilling models. I'll say something and she'll just look at me without responding for like 30 seconds. And the silence is so uncomfortable that I keep talking, and before I know it, I've told her things I didn't even know I was thinking. That's called therapy, Ava. It's called psychological warfare. Same thing. But the changes showed. In May, she took a Friday off. Not for a meeting, not for a strategic retreat, not for any reason other than wanting to spend the day at the cottage. She called Mason at 9 in the morning and said, "I'm not going to the office today," in a voice that carried equal parts exhilaration and terror, like someone reporting a crime they'd just committed. "What are you going to do instead, Ed?" "I don't know. I've never had a Friday off. What do people do?" "Whatever they want." "That's unhelpful." "Read a book. Go for a walk. Sit in the garden and argue with your kale." "I don't argue with the kale." "You told a row of lettuce it was underperforming last Saturday." "It was. The growth rate was below projections." "Ava, it's lettuce. Lettuce with potential." She spent the Friday at the cottage. When Mason arrived that evening after picking Lily up from school, he found Ava sitting on the porch steps with a paperback novel and a glass of wine, her shoes off, her feet bare in the grass, and an expression on her face that he'd never seen before. Not happiness exactly. Something more like peace. The absence of the constant hum that usually ran beneath her surface, the motor of ambition and anxiety that never fully shut off. "How was your day?" he asked. "I read a book." "The whole thing?" "It was only 300 pages. I'm a fast reader." "What was it about?" "A woman who leaves her corporate job to open a bakery in a small town." It was terrible. The prose was atrocious, and the love interest had no personality. I finished it in 4 hours, and I enjoyed every single minute. "That might be the most human thing you've ever said." "Don't tell Dr. Navarro. She'll take credit." Lily ran into the yard and immediately began her chicken inspection, which involved squatting next to each bird and having a conversation that was apparently intelligible to both parties. Ava watched her with the look she'd been wearing more and more often, a look that contained awe and fear and tenderness in equal measure, like someone holding a soap bubble and marveling that it hadn't burst yet. "She starts first grade in September," Ava said. "I know. And the school near the cottage has excellent ratings. I checked." Mason looked at her. "You checked the school ratings near the cottage?" "I check everything. You know that about me." "Ava, are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact about school ratings. What you do with that fact is your business." He sat down next to her on the porch steps. The evening was warm, the kind of spring evening that feels like a promise. Fireflies were beginning to appear in the meadow, small lights drifting through the tall grass like wandering stars. "If we did this," he said carefully, "if we actually moved out here, that's a big change. For Lily. For all of us." "I know. She'd have to leave her school, leave Gloria, leave the apartment. Gloria told me last week that she's thinking of moving closer to her sister in Connecticut. She showed me the listings on her phone." "Gloria told you that?" "Gloria and I talk. We have lunch every other Thursday." "Since when?" "Since December. She's a remarkable woman. She also has very strong opinions about my parking." Mason processed the fact that his girlfriend and his babysitter had been having bi-weekly lunches without his knowledge for 5 months. It was, he decided, either wonderful or terrifying, and possibly both. "The cottage needs work," he said, "real work, not just patched gutters and a kitchen faucet." "I know. I had a contractor come out last week." He gave me an estimate. "You had a contractor?" "I'm a planner, Mason. It's what I do. I plan things. I don't act on them without discussion, but I plan them because having information is better than not having information." "What did the contractor say?" "He said the bones are good. The foundation is solid, the roof needs replacing, the plumbing is old but functional, and the electrical should be updated. 6 to 8 weeks of work. We could start in June and be done by August, well before September." "You have this all figured out." "I have the logistics figured out. The emotional part, the part where we decide to do this together, where we commit to sharing a life in a house that belonged to my dead mother with your daughter, and a motorcycle, and 3 chickens that belong to someone else. That part I'm leaving to you. Why me? Because you're better at the emotional parts. And because if I make this decision alone, I'll optimize for efficiency and forget to account for feelings, and then Dr. Navarro will spend 3 sessions dissecting my avoidance mechanisms, and I can't afford 3 extra sessions at $400 an hour. He laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep, that surprises you, that breaks through the tension and the fear and the careful calculations and reminds you that this exact moment, sitting on a porch with a woman who plans everything and controls nothing and is trying so hard to be something she was never taught to be. This is what being alive feels like. Let me talk to Lily, he said. Okay. And let me think about it. Okay. And Ava? Yeah? Thank you. For planning. For checking school ratings and having lunch with Gloria and getting contractor estimates. For doing all of that without telling me, because you knew I needed to arrive at the decision on my own. I'm a strategic thinker. Don't read too much into it. You're a good person. I'm a recovering control freak who checks school district rankings at 2 in the morning. There's a difference. Not to me. He talked to Lily the next night. They were sitting on the fire escape of the apartment, their spot, the place where important conversations happened, above the noise of the street and below the haze of the sky. Lily was eating a popsicle that was turning her tongue blue and watching the pigeons on the building across the alley with the intensity of a surveillance operative. Bug, how do you feel about the cottage? I love the cottage. What if we lived there, like, all the time, not just weekends? She stopped eating the popsicle, looked at him. Would Ava live there too? Yes. Would the chickens still be there? The chickens belong to the neighbor, Lily, but yes, they'd still be next door. Would I go to a new school? Yes. A different school, closer to the cottage. Would I still see Gloria? We'd visit. And Gloria might be moving closer to her sister, so she might not be in the city much longer anyway. Lily processed this. She was 6 now. Her birthday had been in February, a party at the apartment with 7 kids from her class, and a cake shaped like a dinosaur that Gloria had made, and that tilted dangerously to one side all afternoon until it finally collapsed during the singing, which Lily declared the best part of the whole event. 6 years old. Old enough to feel the weight of change, young enough to still trust that change could be good. Would I have my own room? A bigger one than here. With a window? With a window that looks out at the meadow. Could I paint it? We could paint it together. She took another lick of the popsicle. A pigeon landed on the railing 2 feet away and stared at them with the bold entitlement that only city pigeons possess. Daddy? Yeah, Bug? Is Ava going to be like a mom? The question hit him in a place he hadn't armored. He took a breath. Ava is Ava. She's someone who loves us and who we love. What that looks like is something we'll figure out together. But she's not replacing anyone. She's adding to what we have. I don't remember my other mom. I know. Sometimes I try to remember her face and I can't. Is that bad? No, Bug, that's not bad. You were very little. Do you remember her face? Yes? Does it make you sad? Sometimes. Not as much as it used to. Lily finished the popsicle and wiped her hands on her shorts, leaving blue streaks. She leaned against him, her head against his arm, her small body warm in the cooling evening air. I want to live at the cottage, she said, with you and Ava and the chickens. Then that's what we'll do. Can my room be purple? Your room can be whatever color you want. Purple with stars on the ceiling. Stars on the ceiling might require some engineering. Ava can figure it out. She figures everything out. Mason put his arm around his daughter and held her against him on the fire escape, watching the city darken below them, the lights coming on in windows across the alley, the pigeons settling in for the night on their ledges. This apartment, too small, too expensive, the stool in the kitchen still propped with cardboard, had been their world for 5 years. Every crack in the ceiling, every stain on the carpet, every nick in the wall carried a memory. Lily's first steps in the hallway. The nights he'd spent on the kitchen floor after Emily left. The sound of Ava's knock in the rain. It was hard to leave a place that held your history, even when the place was too small and the history was mostly pain. But that was the lesson, wasn't it? The one he'd been learning all year, through therapy and writing and the slow, patient work of restoring a 50-year-old machine one piece at a time. You don't honor the past by staying trapped in it. You honor it by carrying what it taught you into whatever comes next. The renovation started in June. Mason took 2 weeks off to oversee the major work: the roof, the electrical, the plumbing. Ava took a week off, her second voluntary absence from the office in her entire career, and spent it painting the sunroom with a precision that the contractor described as honestly a little frightening. She taped every edge, he told Mason, every single edge. I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen anyone tape edges like that. She's thorough. She's something. Lily's room was painted purple. Mason spent an evening online ordering glow-in-the-dark star stickers and spent another evening applying them to the ceiling in what he hoped was an astronomically accurate representation of the night sky, but was probably closer to abstract art. Lily didn't care about astronomical accuracy. She cared about stars on her ceiling, and when she saw them for the first time, standing in the empty room with the lights off, her face tilted up, her mouth open. She made a sound that was half gasp, half laugh, and Mason filed it away in the collection of moments that made everything worth it. They moved in August. Not all at once, they'd been gradually bringing things to the cottage over the summer, boxes and furniture, and Lily's ever-expanding collection of stuffed animals. But the official move happened on a Saturday, with a rented truck and Derek and Rachel helping carry boxes, and Gloria supervising from a lawn chair with a glass of lemonade and a running commentary on everyone's lifting technique. "Bend your knees, Derek. You're going to throw out your back." "I'm fine, Gloria." "You're 34 years old and lifting with your spine. You are not fine." Ava carried boxes with the focused efficiency of a warehouse manager, organizing rooms before the furniture arrived, creating a system that involved color-coded labels and a floor plan she'd drawn on graph paper. Mason watched her direct traffic and thought about the woman who'd shown up at his door a year ago, soaking wet, shaking, unable to say what she felt without standing in a hallway because she was afraid that comfort would steal her courage. That woman was still there. Underneath the color-coded labels and the graph paper floor plan, she was still afraid, still learning, still fighting against 30 years of emotional conditioning that told her vulnerability was weakness and control was safety. But she was here, in a house she'd opened to people she loved, carrying boxes alongside colleagues who'd become friends, letting a 6-year-old boss her around about where the stuffed animals should go. "The bunny goes on the bed," Lily instructed. "Not the shelf, the bed." "The bunny has been on the shelf for 3 apartments. This isn't an apartment. This is a house. Houses have different rules." "Who told you that?" "Nobody. I just know." Ava put the bunny on the bed. The first night in the cottage, after the boxes were unpacked and the beds were made and the kitchen was stocked and Lily was asleep in her purple room under her glow-in-the-dark stars, Mason and Ava sat on the porch and watched the darkness settle over the meadow. The fireflies were out in force, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, drifting through the tall grass like a slow-motion fireworks show. The creek caught the last light of the sky and held it. Crickets sang. An owl called from the trees behind the garage. "It's quiet," Ava said. "Too quiet?" "No, just quiet. I keep waiting for an email notification or a phone buzz or someone knocking on the door with a problem, and there's nothing, just this." "Does it bother you?" "It scares me. In a good way, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense." She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. They sat like that for a long time, 2 people at the beginning of something that looked nothing like either of them had planned. Not the sleek, controlled trajectory Ava had been raised to follow. Not the quiet, solitary endurance Mason had resigned himself to. Something else entirely. Something assembled from broken pieces and borrowed tools and the particular stubbornness of people who refuse to accept that damage is permanent. In September, Lily started first grade. She wore a purple backpack, a gift from Ava, and new shoes that she'd picked out herself after a 40-minute deliberation at the store that tested the patience of everyone involved. Mason drove her. Ava sat in the passenger seat holding a coffee she wasn't drinking, her knee bouncing with a nervousness that she was trying very hard to conceal. "You're more nervous than she is," Mason said. "I'm not nervous. Your knee is going 100 miles an hour. I have restless leg syndrome." "Since when?" "Since right now." At the school, a small building with a playground and a garden, and a hand-painted sign that said, "Welcome back." Lily climbed out of the car, adjusted her backpack straps with the seriousness of a soldier checking gear, and surveyed the building. "It's smaller than my old school," she said. "Is that good or bad?" "It's good. Less places to get lost." She turned to Ava. "Are you going to be here when I get out?" "I'll be here." "Promise?" "Promise." Lily nodded once, a sharp, decisive nod that she'd picked up from Ava, and that made Mason's chest ache with how much these two people had shaped each other without trying, and walked toward the building. At the door she turned and waved, not the frantic whole-arm wave of a younger child, a calm wave, a wave that said, "I'm fine. I've got this." Mason and Ava watched her disappear inside. Then they sat in the car in the parking lot and didn't move for a while. "She's going to be fine," Mason said, though he wasn't sure if he was telling Ava or telling himself. "She's going to be great," Ava said. "She's the most capable person I know, and she's 6. She's 6.5. She'll correct you." Noted. They drove to the cottage. Ava went to her home office, a room she'd set up in the sunroom with a desk facing the window that overlooked the garden. Mason went to the garage. The motorcycle sat there, finished, gleaming, ready. He'd ridden it twice, short trips around the property, the engine purring with the slightly rough idle that he'd grown to love because it was real, because it was the sound of something imperfect that worked anyway. He sat on the bike without starting it. Just sat there, hands on the grips, feet on the ground, thinking about the man who'd found this machine in a storage unit 3 years ago, rusted, seized, covered in grime, who'd hauled it home on a borrowed truck and covered it with a tarp, and let it sit for 2 years because he was too exhausted and too broken to imagine restoring anything, including himself. That man had been surviving, day to day, crisis to crisis, running on caffeine and guilt, and the stubborn refusal to fall apart in front of his daughter. He'd been so deep in the machinery of survival that he'd forgotten there was another mode, that you could live, not just endure, that you could build something, not just maintain it, that you could love someone without it costing you everything you had. He thought about Emily, not with anger. That had faded years ago, not even with sadness exactly, more with understanding. She'd left because she couldn't do it, couldn't be a mother, couldn't be a partner, couldn't be the person the situation required. And Mason had spent years interpreting that as a judgment on himself, that if he'd been better, more attentive, more present, she would have stayed. But the truth, the real truth, was simpler and harder. Some people can't stay. Not because of who you are, but because of who they are. And the only thing you can do is stop punishing yourself for someone else's inability and start building a life that doesn't require their permission to be good. He thought about his father, the mechanic who died at 51, the man who worked with his hands every day and died with grease under his fingernails and a heart that couldn't take the strain. Mason had been headed for the same ending, different profession, same trajectory. The slow erosion of a body and a spirit pushed past their limits in service of something that would never push back. His father had never learned to stop. Mason had, barely, just in time. He thought about Ava, about the woman behind the CEO, the woman who mopped floors for the first time at 30 and threw dead kale at him and sat on gymnasium floors in dry clean-only pants, who was still, a year later, learning the basic human skills that most people absorbed in childhood. How to rest, how to trust, how to be present without a spreadsheet or a strategic plan. She wasn't fixed. She would never be fixed, because fixed was a word for machines, not people. But she was different, softer in some places, stronger in others, capable of sitting on a porch and listening to crickets without reaching for her phone, capable of saying "I don't know" and meaning it, capable of love. Not the efficient, optimized, controlled version she'd imagined, but the messy, terrifying, unpredictable real thing. He started the motorcycle, let it idle for a moment, then killed the engine and went inside. Ava was in the sunroom, on a video call. He could hear her voice through the closed door. Measured, professional, the CEO voice. And he went to the kitchen and started making lunch. Sandwiches. Nothing complicated. Turkey and cheese on bread from the bakery in town, with tomatoes from Ava's garden that had actually turned out well this year, round and red and slightly imperfect, with the particular sweetness that comes from things grown by someone who cares too much. When Ava came out of the sunroom, she found him at the kitchen table with his notebook open. He'd been writing all morning, not the novel, which was at 212 pages and counting, but a separate piece, something shorter, something personal. What are you writing? She asked. A thing. A thing. An essay. Maybe. I'm not sure what it is yet. What's it about? He looked at the notebook, at the words he'd put down in the cramped, uneven handwriting that was the only way he could write first drafts, because typing felt too clean, too distant from the mess of creation. It's about a motorcycle, he said, and a building with 39 floors, and a woman who showed up in the rain, and a kid who played a tree in a school play. It's about what it means to break and then decide to put yourself back together, and how the put-together version is never the same as the original, and how that's not a failure. It's the point. Ava sat down across from him. She picked up one of the sandwiches, took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. Can I read it? When it's done. When will it be done? I have no idea. That's a terrible project timeline. It's not a project, it's an essay. Everything's a project. You need more therapy. I have therapy on Thursday. Write faster. He smiled. She smiled back. The wide, crooked one. The real one. The one that still surprised him every time because it seemed like something she'd invented recently. Like a skill she'd acquired after 30 years of not knowing it existed. They picked Lily up from school at 3. She came out of the building with a painting under her arm and a story about a boy named Oliver who had a pet lizard and a girl named Maya who could run faster than anyone and a teacher named Mrs. Patterson who had red glasses and smelled like cookies. I like this school, Lily announced. Yeah? The playground has a tire swing. My old school didn't have a tire swing. That does sound like an upgrade. And Mrs. Patterson said I have excellent diction. Do you know what diction means? It means I talk good. Well, that's what I said. They drove home. Home, the cottage, the place that was theirs now. The place with the purple bedroom and the garden and the garage with the motorcycle and the porch where they sat every evening and watched the fireflies. And Mason cooked dinner while Lily did her homework at the kitchen table, and Ava sat next to her, helping with math problems and occasionally being corrected by a 6.5-year-old who had very firm opinions about how addition worked. After dinner, after bath time, after the story, a new one tonight, because Lily had finally moved on from Where the Wild Things Are to something about a girl who built a rocket ship in her backyard, which Lily considered highly realistic. After the lights were off and the stars glowed on the ceiling and Lily's breathing evened out into the slow rhythm of deep sleep, Mason stood in the doorway of his daughter's room the way he had 1,000 times before, in the old apartment, in the years when standing in this doorway was the only thing that kept him upright, watching her sleep, counting her breaths, marveling at the fact that this small, fierce, hilarious person existed, that she was his, that she was okay. She was more than okay. She was thriving. In a purple room, in a house surrounded by trees and meadows and stolen chickens, with a father who was finally whole, and a woman who was learning to be whole, and a life that looked nothing like the one any of them had planned. Ava came up behind him, leaned against the doorframe beside him. They stood together, watching Lily sleep, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Then Ava reached over and took his hand, laced her fingers through his, squeezed once. Hey, she whispered. Hey, I have a confession. Okay, I checked the school ratings again, 3 times, today. Ava. I know, old habits. Come on, let her sleep. They walked to the porch, sat in their usual spot. The night was warm, the meadow alive with sound, crickets, frogs, the distant call of a bird. Mason couldn't identify. The fireflies pulsed in their silent, random patterns, and the creek whispered at the bottom of the slope. And above it all the sky was impossibly wide, dense with stars that you could never see from the city. Mason thought about what he'd written in his essay that morning, about breaking and rebuilding, about how the cracks don't disappear. They become part of the structure, visible, permanent, proof that the thing survived. He thought about his father's motorcycle that was never ridden, about the polished, perfect object that existed only for display. And he thought about his own motorcycle, sitting in the garage 30 feet away, scratched and slightly rough, and absolutely, unmistakably alive. That was the difference. That was what he wanted to write about, what he wanted his daughter to learn, what he wanted the 300 people in that building to understand. The goal was never perfection. Perfection was a trap, a polished surface with nothing underneath. The goal was function, was connection, was showing up, flawed and tired and uncertain, and doing the work anyway. Not the work of a corporation or a career or a quarterly report, but the work of being human, of loving imperfectly, of failing and trying again, of sitting on a porch with someone who terrifies you and choosing to stay. I love you, Ava said. Not dramatically, not desperately. Plainly, the way you state a fact that you've verified so many times, it no longer requires emphasis. I love you too. I'm going to keep checking school ratings. I know. And I'm going to work too late sometimes, and get controlling about the garden, and forget to eat lunch. I know. And you're going to overcommit to things at work, and forget to take care of yourself, and let Lily eat too many dinosaur chicken nuggets. They're really good nuggets. They're frozen processed poultry in a novelty shape. And they're delicious. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He rested his chin on top of her hair. The fireflies drifted. The creek whispered. The stars turned their slow, ancient circles overhead. Ava? Hmm? I finished the motorcycle. I know, I was there. No, I mean, I finished it. The project is done. 3 years, and it's done. And I keep thinking about what comes next. What do I restore now? What do I fix? Maybe you don't fix anything. Maybe you ride the one you already built. He thought about that. About climbing on that imperfect, slightly rough-idling, beautifully functional machine and just riding. Not to fix something, not to prove something, not to escape or arrive or accomplish, just to ride, to feel the wind and the road and the engine beneath him and be exactly where he was. Yeah, he said. Maybe I do. They stayed on the porch until the air cooled and the fireflies thinned and the sounds of the night shifted from evening to the deep, full quiet that comes after midnight. Then they went inside, checked on Lily one more time, still sleeping, still breathing, still surrounded by stars, and closed the door softly behind them. In the morning, Lily would wake up and demand pancakes. Ava would attempt to make them and produce something lopsided and slightly burnt and absolutely fine. Mason would drink his coffee on the porch and watch the mist rise off the meadow and think about his novel and his program and his daughter and the woman in the kitchen who was fighting a losing battle with batter and winning a larger one with herself. The motorcycle would sit in the garage, waiting, not to be fixed, not to be polished, just to be ridden. And that, Mason thought as he turned off the porch light and followed Ava inside, was what he'd been searching for all along. Not the corner office, not the CEO's approval, not the proof of his own worth measured in late nights and sacrificed weekends. Not perfection, not success as the world defined it. Just this. A house that smelled like paint and tomatoes and someone else's cooking, a daughter with stars on her ceiling, a woman who was brave enough to stand in the rain and say the terrifying thing, a life assembled from broken pieces that fit together in a way no one could have predicted, held together not by perfection, but by the stubborn, daily choice to show up and try again. He locked his front door, turned off the kitchen light, stood for a moment in the dark hallway between Lily's room and the bedroom he shared with Ava, and smiled, because he'd stood in this exact position before, between two doors, not knowing which direction to go, 5 years ago, in a different hallway, in a different life, the morning Emily left. This time, he didn't have to choose. Both doors led somewhere good. He walked toward the sound of Ava brushing her teeth and humming something off-key, and the floorboards of the old cottage creaked under his weight, and the stars on Lily's ceiling glowed through the crack under her door. And outside, the meadow stretched wide and dark and patient under a sky that held more light than anyone could see from the ground.